12,000 years ago, before human beings planted a single seed of wheat, before the first village took permanent shape on the landscape, before pottery was invented, before the wheel was even a dream in anyone's mind, a group of hunter-gatherers climbed to the top of a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey and began to build something that should not exist. They carved pillars weighing 10, 15, 20 tons from the living bedrock. They transported those pillars hundreds of meters. They erected them in great stone circles. They covered them in carvings of animals so detailed, so precise, so haunting that they would not be matched for thousands of years. And then, after centuries of use, they buried the entire complex under tons of earth and rubble, deliberately hiding what they had created, as if sealing away a secret they did not want the future to find. The future found it anyway, and when it did, everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization had to be rewritten. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe, the oldest monumental architecture ever discovered on the face of the earth, a temple complex that predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, a site that predates the Great Pyramids of Egypt by more than 7,000 years, a place built by people who had no metal tools, no draft animals, no writing, no agriculture, and no permanent settlements. People who were, by every definition we had at the time, primitive. And yet they created something that still leaves archaeologists, engineers, historians, and theologians struggling to explain how and why it was done. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To understand why Göbekli Tepe changed everything, you first have to understand what the world believed before it was discovered. For more than a century, there was a story that archaeologists told about how civilization began. It was a neat, logical, progressive story. It went something like this. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. They moved in small bands across the landscape, following the migrations of animals and the seasonal availability of wild plants. They had no permanent homes. They carried what they owned on their backs. Their lives were consumed by the daily struggle for survival, finding food, avoiding predators, sheltering from the elements. They had little time or energy left over for anything beyond the immediate demands of staying alive. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. In a region of the Middle East known as the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the Nile Valley through the Levant and across Mesopotamia, people began to domesticate plants and animals. They learned to cultivate wild wheat and barley. They learned to keep goats and sheep. This was the Neolithic revolution, and it changed everything. With agriculture came surplus. With surplus came the ability to settle in one place. With settled life came villages. With villages came specialization of labor. Some people farmed, others made tools, others wove cloth, others managed trade. With specialization came hierarchy, chiefs, priests, rulers. With hierarchy came organized religion. With organized religion came temples. With temples came monumental architecture. And so the story progressed step by step from the first planted seed to the first carved stone. It was a beautiful story. It made intuitive sense. It followed a logical chain of cause and effect, and for decades it was the dominant narrative of how the human species climbed from the cave to the cathedral. There was just one problem with this story. It was wrong. The ridge is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates from Turkish as Potbelly Hill. It sits about 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa in the southeastern Anatolia region of Turkey. The landscape around it is a rolling expanse of dry, rocky terrain, punctuated by cultivated fields and scattered villages. In the distance, the Taurus Mountains rise to the north. The Harran Plain stretches to the south. The Euphrates River, one of the great arteries of ancient civilization, flows not far to the east. This is a crossroads landscape, a transitional zone between mountain and plain, between steppe and river valley. It is, as it happens, precisely the kind of environment where many of the earliest experiments in agriculture and settlement are believed to have taken place. The hill itself is not particularly dramatic at first glance. It rises gently from the surrounding terrain, its rounded shape giving it the potbelly profile that earned its name. It is roughly 15 meters higher than the surrounding landscape at its peak. Its surface is littered with limestone fragments and dry grasses. From a distance, it looks like nothing more than another unremarkable hump in a landscape full of them. But the hill is not natural, or rather, the hill is only partly natural. Beneath its surface, hidden under thousands of years of accumulated soil, rubble, and deliberate fill, lies one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites ever discovered. A complex of massive stone enclosures arranged in concentric circles, studded with towering T-shaped pillars, decorated with elaborate carvings of animals and abstract symbols, and dating to a period so early in human history that its very existence seemed impossible when it was first recognized for what it was. The first person to notice that something unusual lay beneath Göbekli Tepe was not an archaeologist but a surveyor. In 1963, a joint survey team from the University of Istanbul and the University of Chicago visited the site as part of a broader study of prehistoric sites in southeastern Turkey. They noted the presence of broken limestone slabs on the surface. They found fragments of flint tools. They recorded the site in their survey notes. But they interpreted what they saw as the remains of a medieval cemetery, perhaps associated with an abandoned village. The limestone slabs, they assumed, were fragments of grave markers. The site was catalogued and set aside. No excavation was conducted. No further attention was paid. It is hard to blame them for this mistake. In 1963, the idea that a hill in southeastern Turkey might contain monumental architecture from the 10th millennium before the Common Era was not just unlikely. It was unthinkable. The paradigm of the time simply did not allow for such a thing. Monumental architecture required settled communities. Settled communities required agriculture. Agriculture in this region was not believed to have begun until roughly 9,000 years before the Common Era at the earliest. Therefore, anything monumental must date to a later period. The logic was circular, but it was airtight within its own assumptions. And so Göbekli Tepe sat, unexcavated and unexplained, for another 3 decades. The man who would eventually recognize Göbekli Tepe for what it truly was arrived in 1994. His name was Klaus Schmidt, and he was a German archaeologist working at the German Archaeological Institute. Schmidt was already an experienced excavator of Neolithic sites in Turkey. He had worked at Nevali Quarry, another early Neolithic site in the same region that had produced remarkable T-shaped stone pillars and other monumental remains before being submerged beneath the rising waters of the Ataturk Dam Reservoir in the early 1990s. The loss of Nevali Quarry to the dam was a significant blow to archaeology, and it had sensitized Schmidt to the importance of surveying the region for other sites that might contain similar remains. When Schmidt arrived at Göbekli Tepe in the autumn of 1994, he came with fresh eyes and a different set of expectations than the surveyors who had visited 3 decades earlier. He walked the surface of the hill. He looked at the scattered limestone fragments. He picked up the flint tools. And almost immediately, he recognized something that the earlier surveyors had missed. The flint tools were not medieval. They were not even from the later Neolithic period. They were of a type associated with the pre-pottery Neolithic, one of the earliest phases of the Neolithic period, dating to roughly the 10th and 9th millennia before the Common Era. Furthermore, the limestone fragments on the surface were not randomly shaped. Many of them showed clear signs of having been deliberately worked, carved, and shaped by human hands, and some of them appeared to be fragments of the same kind of T-shaped pillars that Schmidt had encountered at Nevali Quarry. Schmidt later described the moment of recognition in vivid terms. He said that within minutes of walking the site, he knew he was looking at something of extraordinary importance. The sheer density of worked stone on the surface, the character of the flint tools, the profile of the hill itself, which was too symmetrical, too regular, too perfectly shaped to be entirely natural, all of it pointed to a major archaeological site buried beneath the surface. And not just any site, a site of immense age and potentially immense significance. Schmidt returned to the German Archaeological Institute and began organizing an excavation. He secured funding. He assembled a team. And in 1995, the first trenches were opened at Göbekli Tepe. What emerged from beneath the soil would change the trajectory of archaeological thought in ways that are still being processed today, more than a quarter century later. The first season of excavation at Göbekli Tepe was revelatory. Almost immediately, Schmidt's team began uncovering large, carefully shaped limestone blocks arranged in what appeared to be deliberate architectural configurations. Within weeks, the first of the great T-shaped pillars emerged from the earth. It stood more than 3 meters tall, carved from a single block of limestone, its surface worked smooth, its form unmistakable. A flat, rectangular shaft topped by a wide, flat, horizontal cap, the T-shape, the same form Schmidt had seen at Nevali Quarry, but here it was larger, much larger. As the excavation expanded over the following years, more pillars were uncovered, and more, and more. They came in pairs, standing at the center of roughly circular or oval stone enclosures. Additional pillars stood around the perimeters of these enclosures, embedded in low stone walls or benches that connected them. Each enclosure formed a distinct space, a room or chamber of sorts, open to the sky but enclosed on all sides by walls of dressed stone. And at the center of each enclosure, 2 great pillars stood facing each other, taller and more elaborately decorated than the rest. The scale was staggering. The largest pillars discovered at Göbekli Tepe stand more than 5.5 meters tall, which is roughly 18 feet, and weigh an estimated 10 to 20 tons. Some may weigh more. In the quarry area on the hill's southwestern slope, an unfinished pillar was found still partially attached to the bedrock. This unfinished pillar, had it been completed, would have been nearly 7 meters tall and would have weighed an estimated 50 tons. 50 tons, carved from solid limestone. By people who had no metal tools, no wheels, no pulleys, no draft animals. People who worked with stone hammers, stone chisels, and their own physical strength. The radiocarbon dates, when they came back from the laboratories, confirmed what the artifact typology had already suggested. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe dated to approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era. Some estimates push the dates back even further, to perhaps 10,000 or even 10,500 years before the Common Era. This placed the construction of Göbekli Tepe firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, one of the very earliest phases of the Neolithic. It meant that Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 12,000 years ago. It meant that the site was roughly 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramids of Giza, 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 5,000 years older than the earliest known cities in Mesopotamia. It meant that the oldest monumental architecture on Earth was built not by farmers, not by city dwellers, not by priests of organized temple complexes, but by hunter-gatherers, people who still lived primarily by hunting wild game and collecting wild plants. People who, according to everything the textbooks said, should not have been capable of organizing the labor, the logistics, the planning, and the social coordination required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect pillars of this size and complexity. And yet they had done it. The evidence was undeniable. It was standing right there, emerging from the earth, pillar by pillar, enclosure by enclosure, carving by carving. The impossible was real. The question was no longer whether it had happened, but how and why. Let us look more closely at what was actually built at Göbekli Tepe, because the details matter. They matter enormously. Every carved line, every positioned stone, every spatial relationship between pillars and walls tells part of a story that we are still learning to read. As of the most recent published reports, archaeologists have identified at least 20 distinct stone enclosures at Göbekli Tepe through a combination of excavation and geophysical survey. Of these, only a handful have been fully or substantially excavated. The most extensively studied enclosures have been designated by letters. Enclosure A, Enclosure B, Enclosure C, Enclosure D. There are others, some only partially revealed, some known only from ground-penetrating radar surveys that have mapped their outlines beneath the unexcavated portions of the hill. The geophysical data suggest that what has been excavated so far represents only a small fraction of the total complex, perhaps as little as 5%. The full extent of Göbekli Tepe may be far larger and far more elaborate than what has been revealed to date. Each enclosure follows a broadly similar pattern, though with individual variations. The typical enclosure is roughly circular or slightly oval in plan, ranging from 10 to 30 meters in diameter. The perimeter is defined by a low stone wall or bench constructed from rough limestone blocks into which a series of T-shaped pillars are set at regular intervals. These peripheral pillars are generally smaller than the central pair, typically ranging from 1.5 to 3 meters in height. They face inward toward the center of the enclosure. At the center of each enclosure stand two larger pillars, taller and more massive than the peripheral ones, positioned parallel to each other with their broad faces oriented roughly north-south or slightly offset from that axis. These central pillars are the focal points of each enclosure. They are the tallest, the most carefully carved, and the most elaborately decorated elements of the architecture. The floors of the enclosures are typically made of polished or smoothed limestone, sometimes terrazzo-like in quality, suggesting careful preparation and finishing. Some enclosures show evidence of benches or low platforms along their interior walls, as if designed to accommodate seated or standing observers facing the central pillars. The overall effect when you stand inside one of these enclosures and look up at the towering central pillars with their carved surfaces catching the light is one of deliberate, carefully orchestrated spatial drama. These are not random arrangements of stone. They are designed spaces. They are architecture in the fullest sense of the word. Now let us talk about the pillars themselves, because they are unlike anything else in the archaeological record of this period. Or for that matter, of any period for thousands of years afterward. The T-shape is the defining characteristic. Each pillar consists of a tall, flat, rectangular shaft surmounted by a horizontal crosspiece that extends beyond the width of the shaft on both sides, creating the distinctive T silhouette. The crosspiece is not a separate stone placed on top. It is carved from the same single block of limestone as the shaft. The entire pillar, shaft, and crosspiece together is monolithic, one stone. One enormous piece of rock, quarried, shaped, carved, transported, and erected as a single unit. But the T-shape is not merely abstract geometry. Look more closely at the pillars, and patterns emerge that transform the abstract into the representational. Many of the pillars bear carved relief images of human arms running down the sides of the shaft. The arms are long and stylized, with clearly defined elbows, forearms, and hands. The hands typically rest near the bottom of the shaft, fingers extended, positioned as if resting on the belly of the pillar. Some pillars also show carved belts or loincloths around the middle of the shaft, and fox skin loincloths have been identified in some cases. The T-shape, in other words, is not abstract at all. The crosspiece is a head, the shaft is a body. The T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe are stylized representations of human beings, giant, faceless, standing human figures. Some are male, as indicated by the carved loincloths and belts. They stand in their circles, arms at their sides, hands on their stomachs, facing each other and facing inward as if participating in some silent, eternal gathering. Watching, waiting, present. Who were these figures meant to represent? Were they gods, ancestors, mythical beings, spirits of the dead, leaders or shamans of the community that built them? We do not know. The builders of Göbekli Tepe left no written records. They had no writing. Whatever meaning these figures held, whatever names they bore, whatever stories were told about them around fires in the long nights of the 10th millennium before the Common Era, those stories are lost. What remains are the stones themselves, and the stones are eloquent even in their silence. If the pillars alone were all that Göbekli Tepe had to offer, the sight would still be extraordinary. But the pillars are only part of the story. Covering the surfaces of these great standing stones and spilling over onto the walls, benches, and loose stones of the enclosures is one of the most remarkable collections of carved imagery from any period of human prehistory. Animals, everywhere animals, carved in relief on the flat surfaces of the pillars, pecked and incised into the stone walls, rendered in three-dimensional high relief that projects from the pillar surface with startling vitality and detail. The menagerie of Göbekli Tepe is vast and varied, and it tells us much about the world that the builders inhabited and the mental universe in which they lived. Foxes appear frequently, curling around the shafts of pillars, their bodies rendered in sinuous flowing lines. Wild boars are common, their bristled backs and curved tusks depicted with naturalistic precision. Snakes wind their way across stone surfaces, their scales suggested by fine parallel lines. Aurochs, the great wild cattle of the ancient Near East, stand massive and imposing on pillar faces, their horns sweeping forward in bold curves. Gazelles leap and run, wild asses turn their heads. Cranes and vultures spread their wings in dynamic compositions that seem to capture the moment of flight. There are scorpions, their segmented tails curled above their bodies, rendered with anatomical accuracy. There are spiders, their 8 legs splayed in recognizable form. There are lions, or perhaps leopards, their feline bodies sleek and powerful. There are insects that have proven difficult to identify with certainty. And there are creatures that seem to defy easy classification, hybrid forms and ambiguous shapes that may represent mythological beings or symbolic compositions rather than literal depictions of real animals. The quality of these carvings is exceptional. This is not crude scratching or tentative experimentation. The artisans who created these images were highly skilled. They understood proportion. They understood how to use the natural contours of the stone to enhance the three-dimensionality of their relief carvings. They understood how to create visual impact at different scales, from small, delicate depictions of insects and reptiles to life-size or larger-than-life representations of great predators and prey animals. Consider, for a moment, what this implies about the society that produced this work. Skill of this quality does not appear spontaneously. It develops over time, through practice, through apprenticeship, through a tradition of artistic production that is passed from one generation to the next. The carvers of Göbekli Tepe were not inventing their art from scratch. They were working within an established artistic tradition, one that must have existed for some considerable time before the first stone was carved at this particular site. What came before Göbekli Tepe, what tradition it grew out of, remains one of the great unanswered questions in the archaeology of the Neolithic. Among the most striking and most discussed carvings at Göbekli Tepe is a particular pillar in Enclosure D that has come to be known as the Vulture Stone, or sometimes Pillar 43. This pillar bears a complex composition that has generated more speculation, more scholarly debate, and more popular fascination than perhaps any other single image from the site. The central element of the carving is a large vulture, depicted with outstretched wings, apparently holding or balancing a circular object. Below the vulture is a headless human figure. Above and around the main scene are various other animals and abstract symbols, including what appears to be a scorpion, other birds, and a series of geometric shapes that have been interpreted in various ways. The scene on Pillar 43 has been the subject of numerous competing interpretations. Some scholars have suggested that it depicts a funerary ritual, noting the association of vultures with death and excarnation in many Near Eastern cultures. In excarnation, the bodies of the dead are exposed to the elements and to scavenging birds, which consume the flesh and leave the bones. This practice is well documented in later periods in the region and is still practiced in some cultures today. The headless human figure, combined with the prominent vulture, could be seen as a representation of this kind of mortuary practice. Others have proposed more astronomical interpretations. One widely discussed hypothesis suggests that the animals on Pillar 43 represent constellations and that the scene as a whole encodes astronomical information, possibly recording the position of the sun relative to specific star patterns at a particular date in the distant past. This interpretation has attracted considerable popular attention, but remains controversial among professional archaeologists, many of whom regard it as speculative and unsupported by the available evidence. Still others see the Vulture Stone as a mythological narrative, a scene from a story or cosmological drama that was meaningful to the builders of Göbekli Tepe, but whose specific content is lost to us. This is perhaps the most honest interpretation, because it acknowledges the fundamental difficulty of reading meaning into images produced by a culture that left no textual key to unlock their symbolism. What is not disputed is the sophistication and intentionality of the composition. Whatever Pillar 43 depicts, it is not random decoration. It is a carefully planned, meticulously executed scene that was carved into a prominent position on a central pillar of one of the most important enclosures at the site. It was meant to be seen. It was meant to communicate something. And the fact that we cannot fully decode its message 12,000 years later is a humbling reminder of how much has been lost in the vast expanse of time that separates us from its creators. One question that immediately arises when considering Göbekli Tepe is a practical one. How did they do it? How did groups of hunter-gatherers, equipped only with stone tools and human muscle, quarry pillars weighing up to 20 tons or more, transport them across distances of up to several hundred meters, and erect them in precise arrangements within carefully constructed enclosures? The quarry provides some answers. On the southwestern slope of the hill, and on the adjacent limestone plateau, archaeologists have identified the areas from which the pillars were extracted. The quarrying process can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence from the unfinished pillars and abandoned workings that remain in the quarry. The limestone bedrock in this area is relatively soft and workable when freshly exposed, though it hardens upon prolonged exposure to air. The quarry workers exploited this property by cutting channels and grooves into the bedrock around the outline of a pillar, using stone tools, primarily flint picks and hammers, to chip away the surrounding rock and gradually isolate the desired block. The channels were typically around 60 to 80 centimeters wide and up to 2 meters deep, sufficient to allow a worker to stand in the channel and continue cutting downward. Once the sides and top of the pillar had been freed from the surrounding rock, the bottom had to be separated from the bedrock beneath it. This was likely accomplished by driving wooden or stone wedges into a horizontal channel cut beneath the pillar, then prying or levering the pillar free. Evidence of this technique has been found at the quarry in the form of wedge-shaped tool marks and partially detached pillar bases. The unfinished pillar mentioned earlier, the great giant that would have been nearly 7 meters tall and 50 tons in weight, provides a dramatic illustration of this process. It lies in the quarry, still partially connected to the bedrock, its shape clearly defined but its final separation never completed. Whether it was abandoned because of a flaw in the stone, because the project that required it was cancelled, or because the sheer scale of the task exceeded the capabilities of the workforce, we cannot say. But its presence tells us that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were ambitious. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible with the technology available to them, and sometimes they pushed too far. Once a pillar was quarried and detached from the bedrock, it had to be transported to the construction site. The distances involved were not enormous by the standards of later monumental construction, but they were not trivial either. Some pillars were moved several hundred meters from quarry to enclosure, across uneven terrain, without the benefit of wheeled vehicles, rollers, or paved roads. The most likely method of transport involved wooden sledges, log rollers, and large numbers of human laborers. Experimental archaeology has shown that limestone blocks of the size and weight found at Göbekli Tepe can be moved using these methods, provided a sufficient number of workers are available. Estimates vary, but moving a 20-ton pillar using sledges and rollers on unprepared ground would likely require somewhere between 200 and 500 workers, depending on the terrain, the distance, and the efficiency of the technique. This is a significant number of people, and it raises important questions about social organization. A band of 20 or 30 hunter-gatherers could not have built Göbekli Tepe. The labor requirements imply a much larger workforce, drawn from a wider area and coordinated by some form of leadership or organizational structure capable of mobilizing and directing that workforce over extended periods. The erection of the pillars within the enclosures presented its own challenges. The most likely method involved digging a socket or foundation pit into the bedrock or the prepared floor of the enclosure, sliding the base of the pillar into the socket, and then gradually raising the pillar to a vertical position using ropes, levers, and ramps of earth or rubble. This is essentially the same technique that is believed to have been used for the erection of the Sarsens at Stonehenge and the obelisks of ancient Egypt, adapted to the specific conditions of Göbekli Tepe. The precision with which the pillars are positioned within the enclosures suggests careful planning and measurement. The central pairs of pillars are aligned with each other and with the overall geometry of the enclosure. The peripheral pillars are spaced at roughly regular intervals around the perimeter. This is not haphazard construction. It implies the existence of something like architectural planning, perhaps communicated through verbal instructions, perhaps through some form of ground-level marking or The question of who built Göbekli Tepe is intimately connected to the question of how they lived. What do we know about the people who conceived, planned, and constructed this extraordinary complex? The archaeological evidence is clear on several points. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. There is no evidence of domesticated plants or animals at the site during its earliest phases. The botanical and faunal remains recovered from the excavations consist overwhelmingly of wild species. Wild wheat, wild barley, wild almonds, wild pistachios. And in terms of animal remains, the site has yielded enormous quantities of wild animal bones, dominated by gazelle, with significant quantities of aurochs, wild boar, wild ass, red deer, and various smaller species. The animal bones tell a story of large-scale feasting. The quantities are far greater than what would be expected from the everyday subsistence activities of a small residential group. Many of the bones show evidence of butchery and cooking. Some show evidence of having been processed for marrow extraction. The pattern is consistent with repeated episodes of communal feasting, events at which large numbers of people gathered together and consumed large quantities of meat. This feasting model has become central to many interpretations of Göbekli Tepe's function and social context. The idea is that the construction of the site was not the work of a single, permanently settled community, but rather a collaborative project undertaken by multiple groups of mobile hunter-gatherers who came together periodically at this location for ceremonial purposes. The construction work itself may have been part of the ceremony, a communal activity that reinforced social bonds between otherwise dispersed groups. And the feasting that accompanied the construction would have provided the caloric fuel to sustain the workforce. If this model is correct, then Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement, it was a gathering place, a pilgrimage site of sorts. A location where scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, who normally lived and traveled in small, independent groups, converged at certain times of the year to participate in rituals, build monuments, exchange goods and information, arrange marriages, resolve disputes, tell stories, and reinforce the shared identity and beliefs that bound them together as a cultural community. This is a profoundly important idea because it inverts the traditional model of how social complexity develops. In the old model, large-scale cooperation was a consequence of settled agricultural life. People settled down, grew crops, accumulated surplus, developed hierarchy, and only then began to organize large communal projects like monument construction. At Göbekli Tepe, the sequence appears to be reversed. The monument came first, the gathering came first, the ritual came first. And agriculture, when it eventually appeared in this region, may have been a consequence of the social and logistical pressures created by these gatherings, rather than a prerequisite for them. This brings us to one of the most provocative and debated implications of Göbekli Tepe. Did religion, or at least communal ritual, drive the development of agriculture rather than the other way around? Klaus Schmidt himself believed this to be the case. He argued in numerous publications and interviews that the construction and maintenance of Göbekli Tepe would have required large numbers of people to be present at the site for extended periods. These people needed to be fed. Hunting and gathering could supply food for small, mobile bands, but feeding hundreds of workers engaged in heavy construction labor over weeks or months would have placed extraordinary demands on the local food supply. Schmidt proposed that this demand may have provided the incentive for the earliest experiments in plant cultivation. If you need to feed a large workforce at a fixed location, and wild foods alone cannot meet the demand, then you might begin to experiment with ways of increasing the local food supply. You might begin to encourage the growth of wild grains near the site. You might begin to protect stands of wild wheat from competing plants or grazing animals. You might begin, in other words, to take the first tentative steps toward agriculture. This hypothesis is supported, at least circumstantially, by some intriguing evidence. Genetic studies of modern domesticated wheat have traced its origins to wild wheat populations that grew in the hills of southeastern Turkey in the same general area as Göbekli Tepe. One of the closest genetic matches to the ancestor of domesticated einkorn wheat comes from the Karahan Mountains, which are visible from Göbekli Tepe on a clear day. They are roughly 30 kilometers to the northeast. This does not prove that wheat was first domesticated at or because of Göbekli Tepe, but it does place the site at the geographic epicenter of one of the most consequential developments in human history. The idea that ritual and religion may have preceded and perhaps driven the development of agriculture was revolutionary when Schmidt first proposed it. It challenged a materialist, economics-first view of human cultural evolution that had dominated archaeological thinking for decades. It suggested that the human impulse to create meaning, to worship, to gather in sacred places and perform rituals was not a luxury that came after the basic needs of survival were met. It was a fundamental driver of human behavior, powerful enough to motivate the enormous collective effort required to build Göbekli Tepe, and perhaps powerful enough to set in motion the chain of events that led to farming, villages, cities, and civilization itself. Not all scholars accept this hypothesis. Some argue that the dichotomy between hunters and farmers is overdrawn, and that the people who built Göbekli Tepe may have already been experimenting with cultivation in ways that are not yet visible in the archaeological record. Others argue that the site may have been used by a much larger resident population than Schmidt envisioned, reducing the need to invoke periodic gatherings. Still others caution against attributing too much causal power to a single site, noting that the transition to agriculture was a complex, multi-causal process that unfolded over millennia across a wide geographic area. These are legitimate critiques, and the debate continues, but even the most skeptical scholars acknowledge that Göbekli Tepe has fundamentally challenged the old narrative. The temple, or whatever it was, came before the farm. That much is clear. And grappling with the implications of that fact remains one of the central challenges of Neolithic archaeology. Let us return to the site itself and examine some of the individual enclosures in greater detail, for each has its own character, its own emphasis, and its own mysteries. Enclosure D is the oldest and largest of the fully excavated enclosures. Its two central pillars, designated Pillar 18 and Pillar 31, are among the tallest and most elaborately carved at the site. They stand more than 5 meters tall and are covered with relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. Pillar 18 is particularly remarkable. On its broad front face, below the T-shaped head, are carved two arms that run down the sides of the shaft, ending in hands with clearly defined fingers that meet at the front of the pillar, resting on the belly. Above the belt line between the arms, there's a relief carving of a fox, or possibly a fox skin, that appears to be hanging from the belt. Below and around this central composition, additional animals are carved, including wild boar and snakes. Pillar 31, the partner to Pillar 18, bears equally elaborate carvings. Foxes, boars, and snakes appear on this pillar as well, along with birds and other animals. The carving style is bold and confident, with deep relief and clear, flowing lines. The overall effect is of a surface alive with movement and energy, a teeming bestiary rendered in stone. Around the perimeter of Enclosure D, the smaller peripheral pillars also bear carvings, though generally less elaborate than those on the central pair. Some show single animals, others are undecorated. The walls between the pillars are built of rough limestone and show evidence of having been plastered and possibly painted, though little of the plaster survives. A stone bench runs around the interior, low enough to sit on, creating a sense of an enclosed, inward-facing space oriented toward the central pillars. Enclosure C is another major structure, notable for its well-preserved carvings and the exceptional quality of its stonework. The central pillars of Enclosure C bear large, high-relief carvings of wild boars that project dramatically from the pillar surfaces. These boars are rendered with remarkable naturalism, their bristled backs, heavy shoulders, and forward-thrusting heads captured with an artist's eye for form and detail. One of the peripheral pillars in Enclosure C bears the famous carving of a predator, probably a lion or leopard, shown in profile with its legs extended and its mouth open in what appears to be a snarl or roar. This is one of the most dynamic and visually powerful images at the site, and it demonstrates the ability of Göbekli Tepe's carvers to render action and movement in stone. Enclosure A and Enclosure B are somewhat smaller and less well preserved than C and D, but they contribute important information about the site's development over time. The enclosures do not all date to the same period. Stratigraphic analysis and radiocarbon dating have shown that the site was built and used over a span of at least 1,500 years, and possibly longer, from roughly 9,600 to roughly 8,000 before the Common Era. During this time, the enclosures were built, modified, used, and eventually deliberately filled in and buried. The relationship between the enclosures is complex and not fully understood. Some appear to have been in use simultaneously. Others may have been built as replacements for earlier structures that were ritually decommissioned and buried. The overall pattern suggests a cycle of construction, use, and deliberate abandonment, repeated over many generations. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe is one of its most puzzling features. At some point during each enclosure's history, a decision was made to fill it in. The interior was packed with earth, rubble, animal bones, stone tools, and broken fragments of limestone. The fill was not randomly dumped. In many cases, it appears to have been carefully deposited, suggesting a deliberate and possibly ritualized process of burial. The pillars were not toppled or destroyed. They were left standing, entombed in the fill, preserved upright in their original positions. This deliberate burial is what created the Potbelly Hill. Over time, as one enclosure after another was filled in and covered, the artificial mound grew, rising higher and higher above the natural surface of the ridge. The hill that visitors see today is largely an artifact of this process. It is an artificial mound created by successive layers of construction and deposition, but unlike most tells which accumulate gradually through centuries of continuous habitation, Göbekli Tepe's mound was created at least in part by deliberate acts of burial and concealment. Why would people go to enormous effort to build monumental structures, carve them with elaborate imagery, use them for what appears to have been centuries, and then deliberately bury them? This is one of the central mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, and no fully satisfying answer has been proposed. One possibility is that the burial was a form of ritual closure. In many cultures, both ancient and modern, sacred structures and objects have a life cycle. They are created, consecrated, used, and eventually decommissioned in a ritual process that may involve burial, burning, or some other form of intentional destruction or concealment. The burial of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures may represent the final phase of this kind of ritual life cycle. When an enclosure had served its purpose, when its spiritual or ceremonial power was exhausted, or when the community's needs had changed, it was ritually killed, so to speak, and buried, and a new enclosure was built to take its place. Another possibility is that the burial was connected to changes in the social or religious landscape. As the centuries passed and the transition to agriculture and settled life progressed, the old rituals and beliefs associated with Göbekli Tepe may have been superseded by new ones. The site may have been deliberately buried as a way of closing a chapter, of sealing away the old world and its practices as a new world took shape. This interpretation is speculative, but it has a certain poetic resonance. A temple built by the last hunter-gatherers, buried by the first farmers. A third possibility is more prosaic. The burial may have been motivated by practical considerations, such as the structural instability of the enclosures or the need to create a level surface for new construction. but this explanation seems inadequate given the scale and apparent deliberateness of the burial process. Filling an enclosure with thousands of tons of rubble is not a casual act. It requires significant labor and time. It was clearly something that the community considered worth doing. Whatever the reason, the burial of Göbekli Tepe had one unintended consequence of immense importance to modern archaeology. It preserved the site in extraordinary condition. The fill material protected the pillars and their carvings from millennia of weathering, erosion, and destruction. When the excavators of the 1990s and 2000s removed the fill, they found pillars and carvings that were remarkably intact, their surfaces still sharp and clear, their details still legible after 12,000 years. Had Göbekli Tepe been left exposed to the elements, much of this detail would have been lost. The act of burial, whatever its original purpose, became an act of preservation. To appreciate the full significance of Göbekli Tepe, it helps to place it in the context of what else was happening in the world at the time it was built. 12,000 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last ice age. The great glaciers that had covered much of northern Europe and northern Asia during the Pleistocene were in retreat, though the process was not smooth or linear. The climate fluctuated, with periods of warming interrupted by sharp cold snaps, most notably the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions that lasted from roughly 10,800 to roughly 9,600 years before the Common Era. The Younger Dryas is particularly relevant to the story of Göbekli Tepe because it coincides roughly with the period during which the site was founded. Some researchers have suggested that the climatic stress of the Younger Dryas may have played a role in the social and cultural changes that led to the construction of the site. The cold, dry conditions of the Younger Dryas would have reduced the availability of wild food resources, placing pressure on hunter-gatherer populations and potentially driving them to new strategies of cooperation, resource management, and social organization. The construction of a monumental gathering place like Göbekli Tepe could be seen as a response to this pressure, a way of strengthening social networks and collective identity in the face of environmental adversity. This is an appealing hypothesis, but it should be treated with caution. The dating of Göbekli Tepe's earliest phases is not precise enough to determine with certainty whether construction began during the Younger Dryas or slightly after it ended. And the relationship between climate change and cultural change is rarely simple or direct. Climate provides context, not causation. What is clear is that the world in which Göbekli Tepe was built was a world in flux. The climate was changing, the landscape was transforming, plant and animal communities were shifting in response to new temperature and precipitation patterns. Human populations were adapting, experimenting, and innovating. The transition from the mobile, flexible lifeways of the Pleistocene to the settled, agricultural lifeways of the Holocene was underway, though it was far from complete and would not be fully realized for several more millennia. Göbekli Tepe sits at the hinge point of this transition. It belongs to neither the old world nor the new, but to the turbulent, creative period of transformation between them. Its builders were people caught between two ways of life, still rooted in the hunting and gathering traditions of their ancestors, but beginning to reach toward something different, something bigger, something that would require new forms of social organization, new kinds of labor, and perhaps new kinds of belief. The animal carvings at Göbekli Tepe deserve further attention because they raise important questions about the symbolic and spiritual world of the builders. Several features of the animal imagery are noteworthy. First, the animals depicted at Göbekli Tepe are overwhelmingly wild, dangerous, and untamed. There are no depictions of domesticated animals, which is consistent with the pre-agricultural dating of the site. But even among wild animals, the emphasis is on predators and creatures associated with danger, death, and the wild world beyond human control. Lions, leopards, scorpions, snakes, vultures, wild boars with their sharp tusks. These are not the gentle, pastoral images of later Neolithic art. They are images of a world that was powerful, unpredictable, and threatening. a world in which humans were not yet fully in control. Second, the animals are depicted without any human hunters. There are no scenes of humans stalking prey, throwing spears, or celebrating successful hunts. This is a significant absence because hunting scenes are extremely common in later prehistoric art from many parts of the world. At Göbekli Tepe, the animals stand alone in their own right as autonomous beings of power and significance. They are not shown as resources to be exploited, but as forces to be reckoned with. Third, the relationship between the animal carvings and the human form pillars suggests a complex symbolic system. The animals are carved onto the bodies of the anthropomorphic pillars as if they are somehow associated with or attached to the human figures. This has led some scholars to suggest that the animals may represent totemic emblems, spirit helpers, or mythological attributes of the beings represented by the pillars. Each pillar figure in this interpretation would have its own associated animal or animals, perhaps reflecting a clan identity, a spiritual power, or a narrative role in a mythological drama. Fourth, the selection of animals varies between enclosures. While some species, such as foxes and snakes, appear in multiple enclosures, others seem to be concentrated in specific locations. This has led to the suggestion that different enclosures may have been associated with different social groups, each with its own totem animal or symbolic repertoire. If Göbekli Tepe was indeed a gathering place for multiple bands or clans of hunter-gatherers, then the different enclosures might represent the ritual spaces of different groups, each decorated with the symbols and imagery specific to that group's identity and beliefs. This interpretation is speculative, but it is consistent with what we know about the social organization of many hunter-gatherer societies documented by ethnography. In many such societies, social identity is closely linked to totemic animals or other natural symbols, and ritual spaces are often divided along clan or moiety lines. The architecture of Göbekli Tepe, with its multiple distinct enclosures, each with its own decorative program, is at least compatible with this kind of social structure. The foxes of Göbekli Tepe deserve special mention because they are the most frequently depicted animal at the site and seem to have held particular significance for the builders. Foxes appear on pillars in every major enclosure. They are carved in relief, incised in line, and depicted in a variety of positions and contexts. Some are shown in profile, trotting, or standing. Others are carved three-dimensionally, their bodies wrapping around the edges of pillars. In several cases, foxes are depicted on or near the belt areas of the anthropomorphic pillars, as if they are hanging from the belts as trophies or adornments, similar to the way fox skin loincloths or pendants might be worn. The emphasis on foxes is surprising because foxes are not typically considered major symbolic animals in later Near Eastern cultures, where bulls, lions, and eagles tend to dominate the iconographic repertoire. But in the world of Göbekli Tepe, the fox apparently held a position of great importance. Why? One possibility is that foxes were associated with cunning, stealth, and the ability to navigate between worlds, qualities that many cultures have attributed to foxes and similar animals. In a spiritual landscape populated by powerful and dangerous creatures, the fox, with its reputation for intelligence and adaptability, might have served as a mediator figure, a guide between the human world and the world of spirits or the dead. Another possibility is that foxes were significant because of their ecological role. Foxes are scavengers as well as predators. They frequent areas where humans discard food waste, and they are known to visit burial sites and dig up the dead. In a culture that may have practiced excarnation or other forms of exposure burial, the fox might have been associated with death and the transition of the soul from the world of the living to the world of the dead. Whatever the reason, the prominence of foxes at Göbekli Tepe reminds us that the symbolic world of these ancient people was not the same as ours. The animals they chose to honor, to depict, to carve in stone on their most sacred monuments were not necessarily the animals that we would have chosen. Their symbolic priorities were shaped by their own experiences, their own beliefs, their own relationship with the natural world. Understanding those priorities is one of the great challenges and one of the great rewards of studying Göbekli Tepe. No discussion of Göbekli Tepe would be complete without addressing the site's relationship to the broader network of pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the region. Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary, but it is not alone. It exists within a cultural context, a web of related sites and traditions that stretched across southeastern Turkey and the northern Fertile Crescent during the 10th and 9th millennia before the Common Era. Neolithic Quarry, the site where Klaus Schmidt first encountered T-shaped pillars before they were lost beneath the waters of the Ataturk Dam, was one of the earliest known examples. Neolithic Quarry was a small settlement with domestic structures, but it also contained a remarkable building interpreted as a cult or ritual structure within which T-shaped pillars were erected. The pillars at Neolithic Quarry were smaller than those at Göbekli Tepe, and the ritual building was integrated into a domestic settlement rather than standing alone on a hilltop. But the parallels in form and decoration were unmistakable. The same T-shape, the same monolithic construction. The same association with animal carvings and symbolic imagery. Other related sites have been discovered in the years since Göbekli Tepe's excavation began. Karahan Tepe, located about 35 kilometers to the southeast, has emerged as one of the most important. Excavations at Karahan Tepe, which intensified in the late 2010s and early 2020s, have revealed a complex of stone structures with T-shaped pillars that are broadly contemporary with Göbekli Tepe. The site includes remarkable features of its own, including pillars carved with human heads and faces, relief carvings of snakes and other animals, and a unique structure with multiple pillars carved from the living bedrock rather than quarried and transported as separate blocks. Karahan Tepe has shown that Göbekli Tepe was not a unique anomaly, but part of a broader cultural phenomenon. The T-shaped pillar tradition, the monumental stone architecture, the elaborate animal iconography, all of these were shared features of a widespread cultural complex that extended across a significant area of southeastern Turkey. Other sites in this network include Sayfa Tepe, Hamzin Tepe, and several others that are known from surface surveys but have not yet been extensively excavated. This network of sites raises the possibility that what we see at Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of something but a culmination. The tradition of monumental stone construction did not spring fully formed from nothing at Göbekli Tepe. It must have developed over time, through earlier, simpler, smaller-scale experiments in stone carving and architecture that have not yet been discovered or recognized. Göbekli Tepe may represent the apex of a tradition that had been building for centuries or even millennia before the first pillar was erected on that limestone ridge. The discovery of this network has also complicated the narrative in productive ways. It is no longer possible to treat Göbekli Tepe as a single, isolated miracle. It must be understood as part of a larger social and cultural system, a system in which multiple communities participated, contributing labor, ideas, and symbolic resources to a shared tradition of monumental construction. Understanding that system, mapping its extent, tracing its origins and its development, is the work of a generation of archaeologists, and it is still in its early stages. The question of what Göbekli Tepe was, functionally and conceptually, remains open and actively debated. Klaus Schmidt called it a temple, and this term has stuck in popular discourse. But what did he mean by temple, and is it an adequate description? Schmidt's use of the word temple was deliberate and provocative. He intended it to convey the idea that Göbekli Tepe was a sacred site, a place dedicated to ritual and religious activities rather than to domestic habitation. The evidence supports this interpretation in several ways. There is no evidence of permanent habitation at the site during its earliest phases. No domestic structures, no hearths for daily cooking, no storage facilities for grain or other food, no middens of everyday refuse. The architecture is too monumental, too elaborately decorated, too labor-intensive to be explained as domestic construction. And the animal bone assemblages, with their evidence of large-scale feasting, suggest episodic, ceremonial gatherings rather than everyday subsistence. But temple is a loaded word, freighted with associations from later religions and later architectural traditions. When we hear temple, we tend to think of a building with a specific religious function, presided over by a specific priesthood, dedicated to specific deities, and integrated into a specific theological system. Did Göbekli Tepe have any of these features? We do not know. We cannot know in the absence of written records or detailed ethnographic parallels. Some scholars prefer more neutral terms: ritual complex, ceremonial center, gathering place, cult site. Each of these terms emphasizes different aspects of the site's probable function while avoiding the specific religious connotations of temple, but none of them fully captures the uniqueness of what Göbekli Tepe represents. Perhaps the most useful way to think about Göbekli Tepe is as a place of meaning-making, a place where the symbolic and social world of its builders was given material form, where the animals, beings, and forces that populated their mental universe were rendered in stone, made permanent, made visible, made shareable. Where scattered bands of mobile people came together, and through the collective act of building and decorating and feasting and gathering, affirmed their identity as a community, their relationship with the non-human world, and their place in the cosmos. This is a broad and somewhat abstract interpretation, but it has the virtue of being compatible with the available evidence without imposing anachronistic categories. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was in the minds of its builders, it was clearly a place of profound importance, important enough to justify the enormous investment of labor required to build it, important enough to draw people from across a wide area, important enough to be maintained and renewed over many centuries, and important enough when its time was done to be carefully and deliberately sealed away. The layers at Göbekli Tepe tell a story not just of construction, but of transformation. The site's history, as revealed by excavation, shows a clear pattern of change over time. The oldest structures, designated Layer 3 by the excavators, are also the most impressive. They include the large circular enclosures with their massive central pillars and elaborate carvings. These are the structures that have attracted the most attention and generated the most discussion. They date to the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period, roughly 9,600 to 8,500 years before the Common Era. Above Layer 3 is Layer 2, which dates to the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, roughly 8,500 to 8,000 years before the Common Era. The structures of Layer 2 are different from those of Layer 3. They are smaller, they are rectangular rather than circular. Their pillars are smaller and less elaborately decorated. The overall impression is of a site that is continuing to be used but with declining ambition and scale. This pattern of diminution over time is counterintuitive. In most archaeological sequences, complexity increases over time. Sites get bigger, buildings get more elaborate, technology gets more sophisticated. At Göbekli Tepe, the opposite appears to have happened. The earliest structures are the largest and most complex, and the later structures are smaller and simpler. Several explanations have been proposed for this pattern. One possibility is that it reflects a genuine decline in the social and organizational capacity of the community or communities that use the site. As the transition to agriculture progressed and people became more settled, the large-scale gatherings that had powered the construction of the great enclosures may have become less frequent or less necessary. The social bonds that had been maintained through monumental construction may have been replaced by other mechanisms, such as trade, intermarriage, or more localized ritual practices. Another possibility is that the pattern is an artifact of the excavation rather than a real phenomenon. It is possible that large, impressive structures dating to Layer 2 exist in unexcavated portions of the site, and that the rectangular structures so far uncovered from this period are peripheral or secondary structures rather than the main ritual spaces. A third possibility is that the pattern reflects a deliberate architectural choice rather than a decline. The builders of the later structures may have chosen to build differently, not because they could not build on the same scale as their predecessors, but because their needs, beliefs, or aesthetic preferences had changed. The relationship between Layer 3 and Layer 2 at Göbekli Tepe remains an active area of research and debate. As more of the site is excavated and more data becomes available, the picture will undoubtedly become clearer. But for now, the pattern stands as one of the site's many intriguing puzzles. The food remains from Göbekli Tepe provide a window into the subsistence practices of the builders and the feasting activities that accompanied the site's construction and use. As mentioned earlier, the animal bones from the site are dominated by wild species, with gazelle being the most common. This is consistent with what we know about the hunting practices of pre-pottery Neolithic communities in the region. Gazelle were abundant on the steppe lands of southeastern Turkey during this period, and they were a primary food source for human populations throughout the region. But the sheer volume of animal bones at Göbekli Tepe is remarkable. Tens of thousands of bone fragments have been recovered from the fill material within the enclosures and from associated deposits. The bones represent hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individual animals. This is far more than would be expected from the routine food consumption of a small group. It is consistent with large-scale communal feasting events at which significant quantities of meat were prepared and consumed by large numbers of people. Experimental studies and ethnographic comparisons have provided some estimates of the scale of these feasts. Based on the quantity of bone recovered and the estimated meat yield of the species represented, some researchers have calculated that individual feasting events at Göbekli Tepe may have involved the consumption of dozens of animals and the feeding of hundreds of people. If such events occurred regularly, the logistical demands would have been substantial. The plant remains from the site include wild wheat, wild barley, and various wild fruits and nuts. As with the animal remains, these are all wild species. There is no evidence of cultivation or domestication during the earliest phases of the site. However, the presence of large quantities of wild grain in the deposits has raised the possibility that the builders were engaged in intensive harvesting and processing of wild cereals, a subsistence strategy that may have been a precursor to deliberate cultivation. Grinding stones and other plant processing tools have been found at the site, indicating that the preparation of plant foods, including the grinding of grain into flour, was part of the activities conducted there. Some researchers have speculated that beer, or a fermented grain beverage of some kind, may have been produced at the site for consumption during feasting events. This hypothesis is based partly on the presence of large stone vessels at the site that could have been used for fermentation, and partly on ethnographic parallels with other cultures in which the production of alcoholic beverages plays a central role in communal feasting and ritual gatherings. The idea that beer may have been invented before bread, that the desire for alcoholic beverages may have been one of the motivations for the earliest experiments in grain cultivation, is a provocative one that has generated considerable popular interest. It remains unproven, but it is not implausible, and the evidence from Göbekli Tepe is at least consistent with it. We must also consider what Göbekli Tepe tells us about the cognitive and intellectual capabilities of its builders. This is important because there has been a persistent tendency in popular culture, and even in some academic discourse, to underestimate the intelligence and creativity of prehistoric people. The word primitive, though largely abandoned in professional archaeology, still lingers in popular consciousness as a description of pre-agricultural societies. Göbekli Tepe demolishes this stereotype with devastating finality. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were cognitively modern humans. They had the same brain size, the same neural architecture, the same capacity for language, abstract thought, planning, creativity, and symbolic expression as any human being alive today. What they lacked was not intelligence but accumulated technological knowledge. They did not have metal tools because the technology of metallurgy had not yet been invented. They did not have writing because the technology of writing had not yet been developed. They did not have wheeled vehicles because the wheel had not yet been conceived, but within the constraints of their available technology, they achieved things of extraordinary sophistication and ambition. Consider the planning required to build even a single enclosure at Göbekli Tepe. Someone had to conceive the design. Someone had to determine the dimensions, the number of pillars, the spacing, the alignment. Someone had to select the quarry site, identify suitable blocks of limestone, and plan the quarrying process. Someone had to organize the workforce, coordinate the quarrying, transport, and erection of the pillars, and ensure that the work proceeded in an orderly and efficient manner. Someone had to design the carvings, select the imagery, and supervise the carving process to ensure quality and consistency. And all of this had to be communicated, coordinated, and executed without the aid of written plans, engineering drawings, or any of the other tools that later builders would take for granted. This implies a level of social organization, leadership, and communication that far exceeds what was traditionally attributed to hunter-gatherer societies. It implies the existence of individuals with specialized knowledge and skills, planners and organizers who could conceptualize a complex project and see it through to completion. It implies the existence of skilled artisans whose abilities were recognized and valued by the community. And it implies the existence of a shared symbolic system, a common language of meaning and belief that made the entire enterprise meaningful and motivating to all who participated. Göbekli Tepe forces us to revise our understanding of what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of. Not in the distant future, not after millennia of gradual cultural evolution, but 12,000 years ago, at the very dawn of the Neolithic, human beings were already capable of conceiving and executing monumental projects of breathtaking ambition and skill. The implications of this fact extend far beyond the archaeology of southeastern Turkey. They speak to the nature of human creativity, human social organization, and human spiritual life at a fundamental level. The site's discovery also compelled archaeologists and historians to rethink the concept of complexity itself. For generations, complexity in human societies was measured primarily in economic terms: agriculture, surplus, trade, urbanization, stratification. These were the markers of a complex society, and they were arranged in a progressive sequence. No agriculture, no complexity, no surplus, no specialization, no cities, no civilization. Göbekli Tepe suggests that this equation is too simple. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had none of the traditional markers of complexity: no agriculture, no villages, no surplus storage, no evidence of social stratification in the material sense. And yet they built something that is, by any measure, the product of a complex society. A society capable of mobilizing large amounts of labor, organizing it effectively, and directing it toward a shared goal over an extended period. This has led some scholars to propose a distinction between economic complexity and social or ideological complexity. A society can be economically simple, consisting of small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers with no surplus and no permanent settlements, and yet be socially and ideologically complex, possessing elaborate belief systems, rich symbolic traditions, sophisticated social structures, and the ability to organize large-scale collective action when the occasion demands it. Göbekli Tepe is perhaps the most dramatic example of this principle, but it is not the only one. Ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer societies around the world have documented many cases of groups with simple economic organization but rich and complex social and ceremonial lives. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, for example, lived as mobile hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years while developing one of the most elaborate and sophisticated systems of mythology, ritual, and symbolic thought known to anthropology. The people of the Northwest Coast created monumental art, held elaborate potlatch ceremonies, and built large plank houses while relying primarily on fishing and gathering rather than agriculture. Göbekli Tepe adds archaeological depth to these ethnographic observations. It shows that the capacity for complex social and ideological organization is not a product of the Neolithic revolution. It is older, it is more deeply rooted, it is part of what it means to be human. As the first part of our exploration of Göbekli Tepe draws toward its close, let us pause and take stock of what we have learned and what remains to be explored. We have learned that 12,000 years ago, on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, groups of hunter-gatherers built the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth. They carved enormous T-shaped pillars from the bedrock, transported them to the construction site, and erected them in great circular enclosures. They decorated these pillars with carvings of wild animals of extraordinary skill and power. They gathered at this site periodically, feasting on wild game and wild grain, participating in rituals whose exact nature we can only guess at. We have learned that the existence of this site challenged and ultimately overturned the long-held assumption that monumental architecture, organized religion, and complex social organization were products of the agricultural revolution. At Göbekli Tepe, the temple came before the farm, the ritual came before the surplus, the gathering came before the settlement. We have learned that the site was not built in a single episode but evolved over many centuries, with successive enclosures being constructed, used, and eventually deliberately buried under tons of fill. This pattern of deliberate burial preserved the site in remarkable condition, but also deepened its mystery. Why did the builders seal away what they had created? We have learned that Göbekli Tepe was not alone, but was part of a broader network of related sites across southeastern Turkey, all sharing similar architectural forms, iconographic traditions, and cultural practices. This network suggests a widespread cultural phenomenon, a shared tradition of monumental construction and communal ritual that linked dispersed communities across a significant geographic area. And we have learned that Göbekli Tepe forces us to rethink fundamental assumptions about the capabilities and achievements of pre-agricultural human societies. The builders were not primitive. They were brilliant, they were creative, they were organized, they were driven by ideas and beliefs that were powerful enough to motivate extraordinary collective effort. They were, in every meaningful sense, fully human, but there is much more to explore. The question of the site's ultimate meaning, the symbolism encoded in its carvings, the identity of the beings represented by its pillars, the nature of the rituals performed within its enclosures, the circumstances of its final burial, all of these remain open questions, subjects of ongoing research and vigorous debate. And beyond the questions specific to Göbekli Tepe itself, there are larger questions about what the site tells us about the human journey, about the origins of religion, about the relationship between belief and social organization, about the forces that drove the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and settled life, about the nature of human creativity and the capacity of the human mind to imagine and create things of lasting beauty and power. These questions will carry us forward into the second part of our exploration, where we will delve deeper into the mysteries that remain, the theories that have been proposed, the controversies that have erupted, and the ongoing work of excavation and analysis that continues to reveal new dimensions of this extraordinary site. Göbekli Tepe stood in its circles of stone for centuries, visited by the hunters who built it, illuminated by fires that have long since gone cold, echoing with chants and songs that no living ear has heard. Then it was buried, sealed beneath the earth, hidden from the world for almost 12,000 years. Now it is open again, its pillars rising once more into the sunlight, its carvings visible once more to human eyes. And the story it tells is not just a story about the past. It is a story about us, about who we are, about what we are capable of, about the deep, ancient, enduring human need to create meaning, to build something that outlasts us, to leave a mark upon the earth that says, we were here and what we believed mattered enough to carve in stone. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe have waited 12,000 years to tell their story. We are only beginning to listen. 12,000 years of silence. That is how long the pillars of Göbekli Tepe stood entombed beneath the earth before human hands uncovered them again. 12,000 years during which empires rose and fell, religions were born and forgotten, languages emerged and went extinct, entire civilizations flourished and crumbled to dust. While all of that was happening on the surface of the world, beneath a quiet hill in southeastern Turkey, the stone circles waited. The carved animals watched from the darkness with their stone eyes. The great T-shaped figures stood motionless in their buried chambers, arms at their sides, hands on their stomachs, as patient as the rock from which they were carved. And now they stand in the light again, and everything they have to tell us is more strange, more profound, and more unsettling than we could have imagined. In the first part of our exploration, we laid the groundwork, we described the discovery of the site, we examined its architecture. We discussed the monumental pillars, the animal carvings, the quarrying and construction techniques, the evidence for communal feasting, and the revolutionary implications of a monumental temple complex built by hunter-gatherers before the invention of agriculture. We explored how Göbekli Tepe overturned a century of archaeological assumptions about the origins of civilization. Now we go deeper, into the specific enclosures and what they reveal. Into the theories that have been proposed to explain the site's purpose and meaning, into the controversies that have divided scholars, into the network of related sites that has transformed our understanding of the pre-pottery Neolithic world, into the ongoing excavation work that continues to produce astonishing new discoveries, and into the profound, enduring questions that Göbekli Tepe raises about the nature of human belief, human creativity, and the origins of the world we inhabit today. Let us begin by returning to the enclosures themselves, because recent years of excavation and analysis have revealed details that were not available when the site first came to public attention, and these details deepen and complicate the picture in important ways. Enclosure D, the oldest and largest of the fully excavated structures, has yielded some of the most extraordinary finds at the site. We have already discussed its central pillars, Pillar 18 and Pillar 31, with their carved arms, hands, belts, and fox skin loincloths. But the enclosure contains far more than its central pair. Around the perimeter of Enclosure D, 12 peripheral pillars have been identified, set into the enclosing wall at roughly regular intervals. Not all of these are equally well preserved, and not all bear carvings, but several are decorated with images of considerable interest. One peripheral pillar bears a relief carving of a large bird, possibly a crane or a stork, rendered in profile with its wings partially spread. Another bears the image of a boar, its bristled back and heavy body carved with confident, sweeping lines. Another shows a snake, its body undulating across the surface of the stone in a sinuous curve. The floor of Enclosure D is of particular interest. It is made of a kind of terrazzo, a smooth, polished surface created by mixing crushed limestone with a binding agent and then burnishing the result to a high finish. This is a remarkably sophisticated flooring technique for any period, let alone one 12,000 years old. The terrazzo floor suggests not only technical skill but also aesthetic sensibility, a desire to create a refined, carefully finished interior space. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not merely piling up stones. They were creating environments, spaces designed to produce specific sensory and emotional effects on the people who entered them. Within Enclosure D, a low stone bench runs around the interior perimeter, connecting the peripheral pillars and providing a continuous seating or standing surface for those inside the enclosure. The bench is roughly 40 to 50 centimeters high, comfortable for sitting, and its surface is finished to a smooth, flat plane. The arrangement strongly suggests that the enclosure was designed to accommodate a group of people, seated or standing around the periphery, facing inward toward the central pillars. Imagine, for a moment, what it might have been like to be inside Enclosure D 12,000 years ago. The stone walls rising around you, the peripheral pillars standing like sentinels at regular intervals, the great central pillars towering above you with their carved animals watching from every surface. The smooth floor beneath your feet, the open sky above, because these enclosures were almost certainly unroofed, given their size and the absence of evidence for roof supports. The sound of voices, perhaps chanting, perhaps recounting stories or myths. the smell of roasting meat from the feasts that accompanied the gatherings, the flickering light of fires casting moving shadows across the carved surfaces, making the animals seem to shift and breathe. This was not a casual space. This was a space designed to produce awe, to create a sense of being in the presence of something greater than oneself, to transform the everyday experience of a hunter-gatherer's life into something transcendent, something sacred. The architecture of Göbekli Tepe is, in a very real sense, the architecture of transformation, and understanding this transformative purpose is essential to understanding why the site was built and what it meant. Enclosure C, the second of the major excavated structures, provides additional layers of meaning. It is slightly younger than Enclosure D, though still firmly within the pre-pottery Neolithic period, and its decorative program differs from that of Enclosure D in ways that are revealing. The central pillars of Enclosure C are somewhat smaller than those of Enclosure D, but they are no less impressive in their carving. One of the central pillars bears a large relief carving of a wild boar on its front face, depicted in considerable detail with its characteristic ridge of bristles along the back clearly shown. The boar appears to be in motion, charging or running, its head lowered and its body tense with energy, but it is the peripheral pillars of Enclosure C that have attracted the most attention. One pillar in particular, located on the northern side of the enclosure, bears a composition that has been the subject of extensive analysis and debate. It shows a net-like pattern, a grid of interconnected lines that has been interpreted variously as a representation of an actual net, a symbolic representation of a trap or enclosure, a geometric design with cosmological significance, or simply an abstract decorative motif. Another peripheral pillar in Enclosure C bears the famous predator carving mentioned in Part 1. This animal, shown in profile with its body stretched in a leaping or running pose, is one of the most dynamically rendered images at the site. Its identification is debated. Some scholars see a lion, others a leopard, others a generic large feline. The animal's mouth is open, showing teeth, and its overall posture conveys a sense of power, speed, and danger. It is a masterpiece of Neolithic art, and it would be a masterpiece of art from any period. Enclosure C also contains one of the most enigmatic images at Göbekli Tepe. On one of its pillars, there is a carving of what appears to be a human head, severed from its body, shown in profile. The head is depicted with considerable detail, including what may be a stylized ear and an eye. If this interpretation is correct, it is one of the few explicit depictions of the human face at the site, where most human imagery is limited to the faceless, headless T-shaped pillar forms. The presence of a severed head raises obvious questions about the beliefs and practices of the builders. Head removal, skull caching, and skull decoration are well-documented practices at many pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the Levant and southeastern Turkey. At sites such as Jericho, Ain Ghazal, and Tel Aswad, human skulls were removed from burials, plastered, painted, and displayed, apparently as part of ancestor veneration practices. If the carving at Göbekli Tepe does indeed depict a severed head, it may connect the site to this broader tradition of skull-related ritual, even though no human burials or skull deposits have been found at Göbekli Tepe itself. This absence of human remains at the site is itself noteworthy and has been the subject of much discussion. If Göbekli Tepe was a ritual or ceremonial center, one might expect to find evidence of mortuary practices, especially given the prominent role of death-related imagery, including vultures, scorpions, and possibly severed heads, in the site's iconographic repertoire. Some researchers have suggested that human remains may yet be found in unexcavated portions of the site. Others have proposed that the site's ritual function was distinct from mortuary practices and that the dead were processed or buried elsewhere. Still others have noted that some of the bones initially classified as animal remains may, upon closer analysis, include human fragments that were mixed into the fill material during the burial of the enclosures. Recent reanalysis of bone fragments from the site has, in fact, identified a small number of human skull fragments among the fill material. These fragments show evidence of deliberate modification, including incised lines and possibly drilled holes. This discovery, published in 2017, has been interpreted as evidence that human skulls were indeed part of the ritual practices at Göbekli Tepe, even if complete burials have not been found. The skull fragments may represent the remains of a skull cult, a practice of venerating or displaying modified human skulls that is consistent with the broader pre-pottery Neolithic tradition of skull removal and decoration. The question of skull cults and their relationship to Göbekli Tepe opens a window into one of the most fascinating, and for modern sensibilities, most unsettling aspects of early Neolithic life. The treatment of the dead in this period was remarkably varied and, in many cases, remarkably elaborate. Throughout the pre-pottery Neolithic world, from the Jordan Valley to the Euphrates, the dead were not simply buried and forgotten. They were incorporated into the ongoing life of the community in ways that suggest a profound concern with the relationship between the living and the dead, between this world and whatever world the dead were believed to inhabit. At Jericho, one of the oldest known towns in the world, human skulls were removed from buried bodies, coated with plaster modeled to recreate the features of the face and fitted with shells in the eye sockets. These plastered skulls were then kept in the settlement, displayed and apparently venerated over extended periods. Similar practices have been documented at Ain Ghazal in Jordan, at Tel Aswad in Syria, and at several other sites across the region. At Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, which dates to a somewhat later period than Göbekli Tepe, the dead were buried beneath the floors of houses, and some skulls were removed and kept separately, sometimes plastered or painted. The walls of some houses at Çatalhöyük were decorated with paintings of vultures and headless human figures, images that bear a striking resemblance to some of the carvings at Göbekli Tepe. These parallels are suggestive, though they must be handled with care. The pre-pottery Neolithic world was not monolithic. Different communities in different areas developed their own specific practices and beliefs, even if they shared certain broad themes and concerns. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were part of this world, and they shared some of its preoccupations, but their specific interpretation of death, ancestors, and the supernatural may have differed in important ways from the practices documented at other sites. What the skull fragments from Göbekli Tepe tell us is that the site was connected in some way to the treatment and veneration of the human dead. The carved imagery of vultures, the possible depictions of headless bodies, the modified skull fragments found in the fill, all of these point to a set of beliefs and practices centered on death, transformation, and the relationship between the human and the non-human, the living and the dead, the visible and the invisible. This brings us to one of the most fundamental questions about Göbekli Tepe. What did these people believe? What was the content of their spiritual or religious life? What myths did they tell? What powers did they invoke? What did they hope to achieve through the rituals they performed in these great stone circles? These are questions that, in a strict sense, cannot be answered. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had no writing. They left no texts, no scriptures, no myths recorded in words. All we have are the stones themselves and the images carved upon them. And stones, however eloquent, are ambiguous witnesses. They can be described, measured, catalogued, and analyzed, but they cannot speak. The meanings they held for their creators are locked away in a silence that no amount of archaeological skill can fully penetrate. And yet, the attempt to understand the beliefs behind Göbekli Tepe is not futile. The stones may not speak, but they do communicate through their forms, their images, their spatial relationships, and their patterns. By attending carefully to what is depicted, what is not depicted, what is emphasized, and what is arranged in relationship to what, we can begin to form hypotheses about the symbolic world of the builders. These hypotheses will always be provisional, always subject to revision, always more or less speculative, but they are not mere guesswork. They are informed interpretations, grounded in evidence and guided by comparisons with other cultures for which more complete information is available. Several broad themes emerge from the imagery at Göbekli Tepe, themes that may offer clues to the beliefs of the builders. The first theme is the prominence of dangerous and powerful animals. As we discussed in Part 1, the animals depicted at Göbekli Tepe are overwhelmingly wild, predatory, or otherwise threatening. Lions, leopards, wild boars, scorpions, snakes, vultures. These are not the animals of everyday subsistence. They are the animals of fear, respect, and awe. Their prominence suggests a cosmology in which the natural world was conceived as a realm of power and danger, populated by beings that demanded respect and perhaps propitiation. The second theme is the apparent absence of female imagery. The T-shaped pillars that bear human attributes are consistently depicted with male characteristics, including belts, loincloths, and in some cases what appear to be phallic elements. Female figures, which are prominent at many later Neolithic sites, are conspicuously absent from the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe. This does not necessarily mean that women were excluded from the rituals performed at the site, or that female spiritual beings played no role in the builders' beliefs. It may mean that the specific rituals and narratives encoded in the monumental architecture were concerned with themes, such as hunting, male initiation, or the power of male ancestors, that were culturally coded as masculine. It may also mean that female imagery was expressed through media that have not survived, such as wood, textile, or body paint. The third theme is the emphasis on transformation and liminality, the crossing of boundaries between different states of being. The depiction of headless bodies, the association of human figures with animal imagery, the presence of hybrid or ambiguous forms, all of these suggest a concern with the boundaries between human and animal, living and dead, this world and some other world. In many cultures, ritual is precisely the mechanism through which these boundaries are negotiated, managed, and sometimes crossed. Shamanic traditions, in particular, are often centered on the practitioner's ability to transform into an animal, to travel between worlds, or to communicate with spirits and ancestors. Some scholars have interpreted the imagery at Göbekli Tepe as evidence of a shamanic worldview, in which the carved animals represent spirit guides or power animals associated with specific practitioners or ritual roles. The fourth theme is the apparent narrative or compositional character of some of the imagery. The Vulture Stone, Pillar 43, with its complex scene of birds, headless figures, and abstract symbols, is not a random assemblage of images. It is a composition, a scene with spatial relationships between its elements that suggest a story or a sequence of events. Other pillars also show images that appear to be arranged in deliberate compositions rather than scattered randomly across the surface. If these compositions do represent narratives, then the builders of Göbekli Tepe had stories to tell, myths to illustrate, dramas to enact, and the monumental architecture of the site was, among other things, a medium for storytelling, a library of myth written in stone. The astronomical interpretation of Göbekli Tepe has generated enormous popular interest and considerable scholarly controversy. The central claim, advanced by several researchers outside the mainstream of Near Eastern archaeology, is that the carvings and architectural alignments at Göbekli Tepe encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge, including observations of star positions, solstice alignments, and possibly even a record of the date of a catastrophic cosmic event. The most widely publicized version of this hypothesis focuses on Pillar 43, the Vulture Stone. According to this interpretation, the animals carved on the pillar represent constellations in the night sky. The vulture is identified with Sagittarius. The scorpion below it is identified with Scorpius. Other animals on the pillar are matched with other constellations. The circular object held or balanced by the vulture is identified with the sun. And the overall composition is interpreted as a star map showing the position of the sun at a specific point in the precessional cycle, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the positions of the constellations to shift gradually over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. If this interpretation is correct, then the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed a level of astronomical knowledge that is truly astonishing for their period. They would have had to observe the night sky systematically over long periods, track the positions of stars and constellations with considerable precision, and develop a system for recording and communicating their observations, all without writing, without telescopes, and without the mathematical tools that later astronomers would develop. Some proponents of the astronomical interpretation go further, suggesting that the Vulture Stone records the date of a specific astronomical event, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which proposes that a comet or asteroid impact around 10,800 years before the Common Era triggered the Younger Dryas cold period. In this reading, the Vulture Stone is not just a star map but a memorial, a record of a catastrophic event carved in stone by the survivors. These claims have generated intense debate. Most professional archaeologists who work on Göbekli Tepe and related sites are skeptical. Several objections have been raised. First, the identification of specific animals with specific constellations is subjective and difficult to verify. Different cultures have divided the night sky into different constellation patterns, and there is no independent evidence that the builders of Göbekli Tepe used the same constellation system as any later culture. The matches between Göbekli Tepe's animals and modern or ancient constellation figures may be coincidental rather than meaningful. Second, the astronomical interpretation requires assumptions about the builder's knowledge and intentions that cannot be tested against independent evidence. In the absence of written records or other direct evidence of astronomical observation, it is impossible to confirm or refute the claim that the carvings represent star positions. The interpretation is, in effect, unfalsifiable, which is a significant methodological weakness. Third, alternative interpretations of the imagery, such as the mythological, shamanic, and totemic interpretations discussed earlier, are equally or more consistent with the available evidence and do not require the assumption of sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Fourth, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis itself remains highly controversial among geologists and climate scientists, with many experts disputing the evidence for a cosmic impact event at this date. None of this means that the astronomical interpretation is necessarily wrong. It is possible that the builders of Göbekli Tepe did observe the stars, did track celestial patterns, and did encode their observations in their art. Many pre-agricultural and early agricultural societies around the world have developed detailed and accurate knowledge of the night sky. The suggestion that the builders of Göbekli Tepe did the same is not inherently implausible, but the specific claims made by proponents of the astronomical interpretation go well beyond what the evidence currently supports, and they should be regarded as speculative hypotheses rather than established facts. What the astronomical debate does illustrate productively is the intensity of public fascination with Göbekli Tepe and the desire to find dramatic, revelatory meanings in the site's imagery. Göbekli Tepe is already extraordinary enough without cosmic catastrophe theories, but the human desire for narrative, for hidden knowledge, for the thrill of decoding ancient secrets is powerful. And Göbekli Tepe, with its mysterious imagery and its air of profound antiquity, is an irresistible canvas for such projections. One of the most important developments in the study of Göbekli Tepe since the early years of excavation has been the recognition that the site may not have been quite as specialized, quite as exclusively ritual, as Klaus Schmidt originally proposed. Schmidt's interpretation of Göbekli Tepe as a pure temple site, a place of ritual with no permanent habitation, was based largely on the absence of domestic architecture and everyday refuse in the excavated areas. The monumental enclosures, with their massive pillars and elaborate carvings, did not look like houses. The fill material in and around the enclosures contained large quantities of animal bone and stone tools, but lacked the kind of sustained, stratified refuse deposits that accumulate at sites of permanent habitation. However, as excavation has continued and expanded, particularly after Schmidt's untimely death in 2014, some of these conclusions have been revisited. More recent work has revealed evidence that the picture may be more complex than the original temple-only interpretation suggested. In areas away from the main monumental enclosures, archaeologists have found evidence of structures that are more domestic in character. Small, rectangular buildings with evidence of hearths, food preparation, and everyday activities. These structures are later in date than the great circular enclosures of Layer 3, dating primarily to the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, but their presence raises the possibility that the site's function evolved over time from a purely ceremonial center to a place that included at least some permanent or semi-permanent habitation. Furthermore, reanalysis of the sediments and deposits within and around the monumental enclosures has suggested that the activities conducted there may have been more varied than initially assumed. While feasting and ritual clearly played a central role, there is also evidence of everyday tasks such as tool manufacture, hide working, and food processing. These activities do not necessarily imply permanent habitation, as they could have been carried out by groups visiting the site for ceremonial purposes, but they do suggest that life at Göbekli Tepe was not limited to the performance of rituals. The question of whether Göbekli Tepe was a purely ritual site, a mixed-use site combining ritual and domestic functions, or a site whose function changed over time from ritual to domestic, remains open. The answer may well be that it was all of these things at different times and in different parts of the site. Archaeological sites rarely conform to neat functional categories, and Göbekli Tepe, with its long history, its multiple phases of construction and use, and its enormous unexcavated areas, is no exception. What is not in dispute is that the monumental enclosures of Layer 3, the great circular structures with their massive T-shaped pillars, were extraordinary constructions that served a purpose far beyond everyday habitation. Whatever domestic activities may have occurred at the site, whatever residential structures may yet be found, the central fact remains. The heart of Göbekli Tepe is its monumental architecture, and that architecture was created for purposes that transcend the practical needs of daily life. Klaus Schmidt died on July 20, 2014, of a heart attack while swimming in Germany. He was 60 years old. He had devoted the last 2 decades of his life to Göbekli Tepe, and his death was a profound loss to the field. Schmidt was not only the discoverer and primary excavator of the site. He was its most passionate and articulate advocate. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else, the magnitude of what Göbekli Tepe represented, and he spent the last years of his life traveling, lecturing, and writing, tirelessly communicating the site's significance to both academic and public audiences. Schmidt's vision of Göbekli Tepe as a temple built by hunter-gatherers, a place where religion preceded agriculture, a site that overturned conventional narratives of civilizational development, was bold, provocative, and not universally accepted. But it was grounded in decades of field work, deep knowledge of the archaeology of the region, and a keen interpretive intelligence. Even those who disagreed with specific aspects of his interpretation acknowledged the brilliance and importance of his contribution. After Schmidt's death, the excavation of Göbekli Tepe continued under the direction of a new team, led by Lee Clare and other scholars associated with the German Archaeological Institute and the Sanlierfa Museum. The new team brought fresh perspectives and new methodological approaches to the site, including more extensive use of geophysical survey, digital recording, environmental sampling, and interdisciplinary collaboration. The work that has been done since Schmidt's death has both confirmed and complicated his legacy. His central insight that Göbekli Tepe was built by pre-agricultural people and represents a form of social and ritual complexity that precedes the Neolithic Revolution has been broadly confirmed by continued excavation and analysis. But his specific interpretation of the site as a pure temple with no domestic function has been nuanced and qualified by new evidence, as discussed above. This is the normal process of archaeological interpretation. No single scholar's vision of a site is ever the final word. Understanding evolves as new evidence is uncovered, new questions are asked, and new analytical techniques are applied. Schmidt's work at Göbekli Tepe was foundational and transformative. The work that has followed, building on his foundation, pushing beyond his conclusions where the evidence demands it, honoring his legacy while advancing beyond it, is exactly what he would have wanted. The site of Karahan Tepe, which we mentioned briefly in Part 1, has emerged in recent years as one of the most important and illuminating parallels to Göbekli Tepe. Its excavation has accelerated since 2018, and the results have been nothing short of spectacular. Karahan Tepe is located approximately 35 kilometers southeast of Göbekli Tepe, on a rocky hillside overlooking a small valley. Like Göbekli Tepe, it was known to archaeologists from surface surveys but was not extensively excavated until recently. And like Göbekli Tepe, it has revealed monumental architecture of extraordinary age and sophistication. The site contains multiple structures with T-shaped pillars, some carved from the living bedrock rather than quarried and transported as separate blocks. This in situ carving technique is distinctive to Karahan Tepe and suggests a variation on the construction methods used at Göbekli Tepe. Instead of quarrying a pillar and moving it to the construction site, the builders at Karahan Tepe sometimes chose to carve the pillar directly from the bedrock at the location where it would stand. This required a different set of skills and techniques, involving the excavation of the surrounding rock to expose and isolate the pillar while leaving it attached to its natural foundation. One structure at Karahan Tepe has attracted particular attention. It is a roughly circular chamber, partially rock-cut and partially built from dressed stone, containing multiple T-shaped pillars arranged around a central space. At the center of this chamber stands a single tall pillar carved with a human face and head, one of the most realistic and detailed depictions of a human being from the entire pre-pottery Neolithic period. The face is rendered in 3 dimensions, with a clearly defined nose, brow, eyes, and chin. It stares outward with an expression that is simultaneously calm and intense, serene and watchful. Below the face, the pillar's shaft bears carved representations of snakes, their sinuous bodies winding down the length of the stone. This carved head is remarkable because it provides something that Göbekli Tepe's T-shaped pillars conspicuously lack: a face. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars are faceless. Their heads are blank, featureless slabs of stone. This absence of facial features has been variously interpreted as a deliberate aesthetic choice, a representation of masked or hooded figures, or a convention of the artistic tradition. At Karahan Tepe, at least one pillar breaks this convention, showing a clearly rendered human face. This suggests that the T-pillar tradition was not monolithic, that different communities within the broader cultural network interpreted and adapted it in their own ways. Another extraordinary feature of Karahan Tepe is a carved stone figure that has been widely described as a seated or crouching human form, carved in high relief from the bedrock, with its rib cage prominently displayed. This figure, sometimes referred to as the emaciated man or the skeletal figure, has been interpreted as a depiction of a dead or dying person, a spirit, or an ancestor. Its prominent ribs and gaunt form suggest a being that is not fully alive, not fully of this world. It is a haunting image, and it resonates with the themes of death, transformation, and liminality that pervade the iconography of both Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe. The discoveries at Karahan Tepe have fundamentally expanded our understanding of the pre-pottery Neolithic monumental tradition. They have shown that Göbekli Tepe was not a one-off, not a singular anomaly, but the most prominent example of a widespread cultural practice. Multiple communities across a broad area of southeastern Turkey were engaged in monumental stone construction during this period, each contributing its own variations and innovations to a shared tradition. The relationship between these sites is a subject of active research. Were they built by the same people, by allied groups, by rival groups? Did they serve the same functions? Were they used simultaneously or sequentially? Did they communicate with each other, share resources, exchange ideas? These questions are only beginning to be addressed, and the answers will require many more years of excavation, analysis, and comparative study. Beyond Karahan Tepe, other sites in the region have added further dimensions to the picture. Sayburç, a site near the town of the same name in Şanlıurfa province, has yielded a remarkable carved relief panel dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic period. The panel, discovered in 2021 and published in 2023, depicts two human figures interacting with animals. One figure appears to be grasping or controlling a bull, while another holds or confronts a leopard. The scene is dynamic, narrative, and compositionally sophisticated. It is one of the earliest known depictions of humans actively interacting with or dominating wild animals, a theme that contrasts with the imagery at Göbekli Tepe, where animals are depicted in their own right without obvious human interaction. The Sayburç panel has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence of a shift in the relationship between humans and the natural world, a growing sense of human agency and control over the animal kingdom that may reflect the early stages of the process that would eventually lead to domestication. If this interpretation is correct, then the relief at Sayburç captures a transitional moment in human consciousness, the moment when humans began to see themselves not merely as one species among many, but as beings with the power to master and direct the natural world. Other sites in the region, including Harbitzuvên Tepesi, Enclosure, and several others, have produced evidence of monumental or semi-monumental architecture, T-shaped pillars, or elaborate carved imagery dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic period. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, expanding the map of the monumental tradition and complicating simple narratives of origin and diffusion. The emerging picture is one of a rich, diverse, interconnected world of pre-pottery Neolithic communities, spread across a landscape that stretched from the upper Euphrates to the headwaters of the Tigris and beyond. These communities were linked by shared cultural practices, including monumental construction, animal iconography, and communal feasting, but they were also distinct, each developing its own local variations and innovations. The world that produced Göbekli Tepe was not a world of isolated, scattered bands of primitive hunter-gatherers. It was a world of cultural dynamism, artistic achievement, and social complexity that defies the simplistic categories we have too often imposed upon it. Let us now consider the broader implications of Göbekli Tepe for our understanding of the Neolithic Revolution, that great transformation that took human societies from hunting and gathering to agriculture and settled life. The traditional model of the Neolithic Revolution, as we discussed in Part 1, was a linear, progressive narrative. Hunting and gathering, then agriculture, then surplus, then villages, then towns, then temples, then writing, then civilization. Each step followed logically from the one before, driven by economic necessity and technological innovation. Göbekli Tepe disrupted this narrative by demonstrating that monumental architecture and complex ritual organization preceded agriculture. But the disruption goes deeper than simply rearranging the sequence of events. Göbekli Tepe challenges the very logic of the traditional model, its assumption that economic factors are the primary drivers of cultural change, and that social and ideological complexity are dependent variables, effects rather than causes. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe could organize large-scale construction projects without agriculture, then large-scale social organization does not require agricultural surplus. If they could create elaborate systems of symbolic expression without writing, then symbolic thought does not require literacy. If they could conceive and execute monumental architecture without cities, then monumental architecture does not require urbanization. These are not trivial observations. They strike at the foundations of how we think about the relationship between economy, society, and culture. They suggest that the causal arrows in our models of civilizational development may point in multiple directions or may not point in consistent directions at all. Culture shapes economy as much as economy shapes culture. Belief motivates labor as much as necessity does. Ideas are as powerful as technologies. Some scholars have gone so far as to suggest that Göbekli Tepe represents evidence of a fundamentally different pathway to complexity, one driven by ideology and ritual rather than by agriculture and surplus. In this view, the communities that built Göbekli Tepe and its related sites were organized not around economic production, but around shared belief and communal practice. Their social cohesion came not from living together in permanent settlements, but from gathering together periodically at sacred places to perform rituals, build monuments, and reinforce their collective identity. This model has been called the ritual first hypothesis, or the religion before farming hypothesis, and it has generated intense debate. Its proponents argue that it better explains the evidence from Göbekli Tepe and related sites than the traditional economic model. Its critics argue that it overstates the dichotomy between ritual and economy, and that the two were likely intertwined from the beginning. The truth, as is so often the case in complex historical questions, probably lies somewhere in between. The transition to agriculture in the Near East was not a single event with a single cause. It was a long, messy, multi-causal process that unfolded over millennia across a vast geographic area. Economic pressures, environmental changes, demographic growth, technological innovation, social competition, and ideological motivation all played roles, and their relative importance varied from place to place and from period to period. What Göbekli Tepe contributes to this picture is not a definitive answer but a corrective. A reminder that the non-economic dimensions of human life, the beliefs, the rituals, the symbols, the stories, the shared meanings that bind communities together, are not mere decorations on the surface of economic reality. They are fundamental drivers of human behavior, capable of motivating extraordinary collective effort and shaping the course of historical change. The preservation and presentation of Göbekli Tepe to the public has become a major concern in recent years, as the site's fame has grown and visitor numbers have increased dramatically. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, a recognition of its outstanding universal value and a milestone in the site's transition from an obscure archaeological excavation to a globally recognized cultural landmark. The UNESCO inscription brought increased visibility, increased funding for conservation and research, and increased tourist traffic. All of these developments have presented both opportunities and challenges. The opportunities are clear. Greater visibility means greater public awareness of the site's significance. Greater funding means more resources for excavation, conservation, and analysis. Greater tourist traffic means more revenue for the local economy and more support for the infrastructure needed to maintain and protect the site. The challenges are equally clear. Göbekli Tepe's monumental architecture, though remarkably well preserved thanks to its deliberate burial, is made of limestone, a relatively soft and porous stone that is vulnerable to weathering, erosion, and human contact. Exposure to rain, wind, temperature fluctuations, and the carbon dioxide exhaled by large numbers of visitors can all contribute to the deterioration of the carved surfaces. Protective shelters have been erected over the main excavated enclosures to shield them from the elements, and walkways have been constructed to keep visitors at a safe distance from the most delicate features. But balancing the competing demands of public access, archaeological research, and long-term conservation remains an ongoing challenge. The broader landscape around Göbekli Tepe also faces pressures. Modern agriculture, road construction, and urban development in the Sanliurfa region have the potential to damage or destroy unexcavated portions of the site and related sites in the surrounding area. Archaeological survey and monitoring are essential to identify and protect vulnerable areas before they are lost to development. The Turkish government has invested significantly in the development of Göbekli Tepe as a cultural tourism destination, including the construction of visitor facilities, interpretive displays, and access roads. A new museum in Sanliurfa, the Sanliurfa Archaeology Museum, houses many of the most important finds from the site, including carved pillars, relief panels, stone tools, and animal bones. The museum provides essential context for visitors to the site itself and serves as a repository for the vast quantities of archaeological material that have been recovered over more than 2 decades of excavation. One aspect of Göbekli Tepe that is sometimes overlooked in popular discussions is the sheer duration of the site's use. We tend to think of it as a single moment in time, a sudden burst of creative energy that produced the monumental enclosures and then vanished. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Göbekli Tepe was not built overnight. It was built, used, modified, rebuilt, and eventually buried over a span of at least 1,500 years, and possibly as long as 2,000 years. To put this in perspective, 1,500 years ago from today, the Roman Empire was in its final stages of decline, and the early medieval period was just beginning. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire was at its height. The entire history of medieval and modern Europe, from the fall of Rome to the present day, fits comfortably within the time span during which Göbekli Tepe was an active site. During those 1,500 to 2,000 years, the world changed profoundly. At the beginning of Göbekli Tepe's history, the builders were hunter-gatherers living entirely on wild foods. By the end, the transition to agriculture was well underway in the region. The first domesticated crops were being cultivated. The first permanent villages were being established. The entire mode of human existence was being transformed. Göbekli Tepe spans this transformation. Its earliest phases belong to the world of the hunter-gatherers. Its latest phases belong to the world of the early farmers. And in between, in the long centuries of transition, the site was a witness to, and perhaps a participant in, one of the most consequential changes in human history. The changes in the site's architecture over time, from the large, circular enclosures of Layer 3 to the smaller, rectangular structures of Layer 2, may reflect this broader transformation. As the world changed, as people settled down, as agriculture took hold, the social and ritual needs that Göbekli Tepe served may have changed as well. The great communal gatherings of mobile hunter-gatherers, which had motivated the construction of the monumental enclosures, may have become less necessary or less feasible as populations became more sedentary. The ritual practices that had been conducted in the circular enclosures may have been adapted, modified, or replaced by new practices suited to the new social realities of settled agricultural life. Or perhaps the change was more dramatic. Perhaps the old religion, the old beliefs, the old way of understanding the world were deliberately abandoned as the new way of life took hold. Perhaps the burial of the enclosures was not just a ritual closure, but a decisive break with the past, a deliberate forgetting. This interpretation is speculative, but it has a certain logic. Revolutions, whether economic, social, or ideological, often involve the active rejection and suppression of what came before. The transition from hunting to farming was, in many ways, the most profound revolution in human history. It would not be surprising if it involved the deliberate burial, both literal and metaphorical, of the old world's most sacred places. The question of what, exactly, the T-shaped pillars represent has continued to generate discussion and new proposals. We have already discussed the widely accepted interpretation that they are stylized human figures, with the crosspiece representing the head and the shaft representing the body. This interpretation is supported by the carved arms, hands, belts, and loincloths found on many pillars, but some scholars have pushed the interpretation further, asking not just what the pillars depict, but who they depict. Are they gods, ancestors, spirits, living people? And do the different pillars in a single enclosure represent different individuals, different types of beings, or different aspects of a single being? One influential interpretation suggests that the central pillars of each enclosure represent deities or supernatural beings, while the peripheral pillars represent lesser figures, perhaps attendants, worshippers, or members of a cosmic hierarchy. In this reading, the enclosure is a model of the cosmos, with the great central beings surrounded by their retinue and the carved animals representing the forces and creatures over which they have power or with which they are associated. Another interpretation focuses on the idea of ancestors. In many traditional cultures, the dead are believed to continue to exist in some form and to exert influence over the living. Ancestor veneration, the ritual honoring and appeasing of the dead, is one of the most widespread religious practices in human history. The T-shaped pillars in this view may represent honored ancestors, founders of lineages or clans, whose presence in the enclosure sanctified the space and connected the living community to its past. A third interpretation sees the pillars as representations of living individuals, perhaps leaders, shamans, or other important members of the community. The carving of a pillar might have been a way of honoring a living person, commemorating their achievements, or investing them with spiritual authority. In this reading, the enclosures would function as a kind of hall of fame, a place where the most important individuals in the community were represented in stone. Each of these interpretations has strengths and weaknesses, and none can be definitively confirmed or refuted with the evidence currently available. What they all share is the recognition that the pillars are not mere architectural elements. They are representations of beings, human or superhuman, whose presence in the enclosure was essential to its meaning and function. The pillars are not just holding up a roof, there was no roof. They are not just marking a boundary, the walls do that. They are presences, they are entities, they are the reason the enclosure exists. This is a profound insight because it suggests that the architecture of Göbekli Tepe is fundamentally different from ordinary construction. It is not utilitarian, it is not decorative, it is incarnational. The enclosure is not a building in which rituals happen to take place. It is itself a ritual object, a three-dimensional representation of a cosmological reality, a place where the boundary between the human world and the world of spirits, ancestors, or gods is made thin. You do not just enter an enclosure at Göbekli Tepe. You enter a different kind of reality. You stand in the presence of beings whose stone eyes watch you from every direction. You are surrounded. You are observed. You are, in some sense, held. The acoustics of the enclosures have received some attention from researchers interested in the sensory experience of the rituals performed at the site. While no systematic acoustic study of Göbekli Tepe has been published to date, the physical characteristics of the enclosures, circular or oval in plan, enclosed by stone walls open to the sky, suggest that they would have had distinctive acoustic properties. Circular stone enclosures tend to focus and amplify sound, creating resonance effects that can make spoken words, chanting, drumming, or other sonic activities seem louder, richer, and more enveloping than they would in an open-air setting. Anyone who has stood inside a circular stone structure, whether a prehistoric monument, a Romanesque church, or a modern amphitheater, knows the uncanny effect that curved stone walls can have on sound. Voices seem to come from everywhere. Echoes multiply and overlap. The space seems to vibrate with the sound of its own enclosure. If the rituals at Göbekli Tepe involved chanting, singing, drumming, or other forms of sound production, the acoustic properties of the enclosures would have enhanced and intensified the experience. The sound would have wrapped around the participants, enveloping them in a cocoon of resonance that would have heightened the emotional and spiritual impact of the ritual. Combined with the visual impact of the carved pillars, the play of firelight on stone surfaces, and whatever other sensory elements such as incense, body paint, costume, or the consumption of psychoactive substances may have been part of the ritual repertoire, the overall effect would have been overwhelming. This multisensory approach to ritual is well documented in many cultures around the world, and there is no reason to doubt that the builders of Göbekli Tepe understood and exploited it. They were not naive, they were not fumbling toward ritual through random experimentation. They were creating total environments, spaces designed to engage every sense, to overwhelm the everyday consciousness of the participants, and to transport them into a state of heightened awareness and receptivity. This is what ritual does across cultures and across millennia, and the architecture of Göbekli Tepe was designed from the ground up to facilitate this transformation. Let us now consider an aspect of the Göbekli Tepe story that is often overlooked but is of enormous importance: the site's relationship to the landscape. Göbekli Tepe sits on a prominent ridge, one of the highest points in the immediate area. From the top of the hill, the view extends for many kilometers in every direction. To the north, the Taurus Mountains. To the south, the Harran Plain. To the east and west, rolling hills and valleys. On a clear day, the visibility is extraordinary. This elevated, highly visible location was not chosen by accident. In many cultures, both ancient and modern, mountaintops, hilltops, and other high places are considered sacred. They are closer to the sky, closer to the sun and the stars, closer to the realm of the gods or spirits. They are places where the human world and the supernatural world come into closest contact. They are places of revelation, of vision, of transcendence. The builders of Göbekli Tepe chose to build their monument on a hilltop that could be seen from far away and from which far-off places could be seen. The site was visible. It was a landmark, a beacon, a marker on the landscape that announced its presence to anyone traveling in the region. This visibility was almost certainly intentional. The monument was not hidden away in a valley or tucked into a cave. It was displayed, elevated, made prominent. It was meant to be seen. At the same time, the view from the site was outward. From within the enclosures, the surrounding landscape was visible, at least above the walls. The mountains, the plains, the sky, all were part of the visual experience of being at Göbekli Tepe. The site was not enclosed or cut off from the wider world. It was embedded in the landscape, connected to it, oriented within it. Some researchers have investigated whether the enclosures were oriented towards specific landscape features, astronomical phenomena, or cardinal directions. The results have been mixed. Some enclosures show possible alignments with the rising or setting positions of bright stars or with specific landscape features such as mountain peaks. Others show no clear orientation pattern. The evidence for deliberate astronomical or landscape alignment is suggestive but not conclusive, and the question remains open. What is clear is that the location of Göbekli Tepe was chosen with care and intention. It was not a random spot. It was a place with meaning, a place that connected the built environment of the monument to the natural environment of the surrounding landscape and the celestial environment of the sky above. The monument was not just a structure in a place. It was a place, a node in a web of spatial and symbolic relationships that extended outward from the hilltop to the horizon and beyond. Social implications of Göbekli Tepe continue to be debated and refined. One of the most productive lines of inquiry concerns the question of labor organization and social inequality. As we discussed in Part 1, the construction of Göbekli Tepe required large numbers of workers, organized and coordinated over extended periods. This level of organization implies some form of leadership, some mechanism for mobilizing and directing collective labor. But what kind of leadership? And does it imply social inequality, the existence of a ruling class or an elite that commanded the labor of others? The traditional assumption was that monumental construction required coercive authority. Someone with power must have ordered the workers to quarry, transport, and erect the stones. This assumption was rooted in our experience of later monumental construction, from the pyramids of Egypt to the cathedrals of medieval Europe, which were typically directed by rulers, priests, or other members of a ruling elite, using a combination of religious authority, political power, and economic leverage to mobilize labor. But this model may not apply to Göbekli Tepe. The hunter-gatherer societies that built the site are unlikely to have had formalized political hierarchies of the kind seen in later states and chiefdoms. They did not have the economic surpluses, the specialized institutions, or the coercive mechanisms that characterize stratified societies. Their leadership was likely more informal, based on personal prestige, religious authority, or demonstrated skill rather than on inherited rank or accumulated wealth. Some scholars have proposed that the construction of Göbekli Tepe was organized through a system of communal labor in which work was motivated by shared belief and social obligation rather than by coercive authority. In this model, the construction of the monument was a collective act of devotion, undertaken willingly by participants who saw themselves as contributing to a shared sacred project. The feasting that accompanied the construction would have served as both motivation and reward, providing food, drink, social interaction, and spiritual fulfillment to the workers. This communal labor model is consistent with what we know about labor organization in many documented hunter-gatherer and early horticultural societies. In these societies, large-scale projects are often organized through systems of reciprocity and social obligation. Groups take turns hosting feasts and work parties with the expectation that the favor will be returned in the future. Labor is mobilized not through commands but through invitations, gifts, and the social pressure of reciprocity. Other scholars have been more cautious, noting that the scale and duration of construction at Göbekli Tepe may have required more formal organizational structures than the communal labor model allows. They point to the consistency of the architectural plans, the quality control evident in the carving, and the long-term continuity of the construction program as evidence that some individuals or groups exercised sustained authority over the project. This does not necessarily imply a coercive ruling class, but it may imply the existence of religious leaders, master builders, or other specialists whose authority was recognized and respected by the broader community. The truth may be that the social organization behind Göbekli Tepe does not fit neatly into any of our existing categories. It may have been something new, something unprecedented, a form of social organization that emerged in response to the specific demands of the project, and that left no clear parallel in either the ethnographic record or the archaeological record of later periods. If so, it would not be the first time that Göbekli Tepe has defied our categories. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, which we discussed at length in Part 1, continues to fascinate and perplex. Let us add a few further observations and reflections. The fill material used to bury the enclosures has been extensively studied, and it provides important information about the process and timing of the burial. The fill consists of a mixture of earth, rubble, broken stone, animal bones, flint tools, and other cultural debris. It was not brought from a single source, but appears to have been collected from multiple locations, including the quarry area, nearby settlement sites, and possibly the surface of the hill itself. The fill was not deposited in a single event, but in multiple episodes, as indicated by the layered structure of the deposits within the enclosures. Each layer represents a distinct episode of deposition, separated from the layers above and below by surfaces that suggest pauses or interruptions in the filling process. This suggests that the burial of each enclosure was not a quick, one-time event, but a prolonged process that may have extended over years or even decades. Some of the material in the fill appears to have been deliberately selected rather than randomly shoveled in. Certain types of animal bones, certain types of stone tools, and certain fragments of carved stone appear in concentrations that suggest intentional placement rather than random disposal. This has led some researchers to suggest that the burial process was itself a ritual activity involving the deliberate deposition of symbolically significant objects as offerings or dedications. If the burial was indeed a ritual process, then it adds another layer of meaning to the already complex story of Göbekli Tepe. The enclosures were not just built and used and then abandoned. They were built, used, ritually closed, and ceremonially buried. Each phase of this cycle, construction, use, closure, and burial, would have been accompanied by its own rituals, its own ceremonies, its own social and spiritual significance. The life of an enclosure was a complete narrative arc, from birth through maturity to death and interment, mirroring perhaps the human life cycle that the builders experienced in their own lives. This interpretation resonates with a concept found in many cultures: the idea that built structures are alive, that they have spirits, personalities, lifespans, that they are born when they are built, live while they are used, and die when they are no longer needed or when their spiritual power is exhausted. In this worldview, the burial of a building is not destruction but transformation. It is a return to the earth, a passage from one state of being to another. The building does not cease to exist. It changes its mode of existence, passing from the visible world to the invisible, from the realm of the living to the realm of the ancestors or the spirits. Whether the builders of Göbekli Tepe held such beliefs, we cannot know. But the care and apparent intentionality with which they buried their enclosures suggest that the burial was far more than a practical act. It was a meaningful act, charged with significance that we can sense, even if we cannot fully articulate it. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, let us reflect on what Göbekli Tepe means in the broadest sense. Not just what it tells us about the pre-pottery Neolithic period or the origins of agriculture or the development of social complexity, but what it tells us about the human condition itself. Göbekli Tepe tells us that the impulse to create sacred space is ancient. It is not a product of civilization. It is not a luxury that appears only when survival needs are met. It is a fundamental aspect of human nature, present at the very dawn of the Neolithic and probably much earlier. Human beings have been creating sacred spaces, marking special places, building structures to house their beliefs and their rituals, for as long as they have been recognizably human. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest known example of this impulse on a monumental scale, but it is almost certainly not the first example. There must have been earlier attempts, earlier experiments, earlier sacred places that have not survived the passage of time or have not yet been discovered. Göbekli Tepe tells us that the human capacity for cooperation and collective action is more deeply rooted than we sometimes assume. We live in a world where large-scale cooperation is often viewed with cynicism, where collective projects are seen as the products of coercion, self-interest, or institutional compulsion. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that 12,000 years ago, before any of those institutional structures existed, human beings were already capable of coming together in large numbers, working toward a shared goal and creating something magnificent. They did not do it for profit. They did not do it under threat of punishment. They did it because they believed in something, because the act of building together, feasting together, worshiping together was itself meaningful and valuable. Because the bonds of shared belief and shared labor were strong enough to motivate extraordinary sacrifice and effort. Göbekli Tepe tells us that art and symbolic expression are not mere ornaments on the surface of practical life. They are central to what makes us human. The carvers of Göbekli Tepe did not need to decorate their pillars with elaborate images of animals. They could have erected plain, uncarved stones and achieved the same structural result, but they did not. They carved, they created. They expressed because expression, the making visible of the invisible, the giving form to belief and feeling and imagination, is a human need as basic as food and shelter. The carvings of Göbekli Tepe are not just decorations, they are communications. They are conversations between the builders and their world, between the human and the more than human, between the present and the eternal. Göbekli Tepe tells us that the past is not what we think it is. Every generation tends to assume that it stands at the pinnacle of human achievement, that the people who came before were simpler, cruder, less capable, less intelligent, less fully human. Göbekli Tepe demolishes this assumption with the force of a 20-ton limestone pillar. The people who built this site were not primitive, they were not inferior. They were human beings of extraordinary intelligence, creativity, ambition, and spiritual depth. They lived in a world without metal, without writing, without agriculture, without cities, and yet they created something that still has the power to inspire 12,000 years later. If they could do that, what else might they have done that we have not yet discovered? What other achievements of the deep human past lie buried, waiting for the excavator's trowel to bring them back into the light? The excavation of Göbekli Tepe is far from complete. As mentioned earlier, geophysical surveys suggest that only a small fraction of the total complex has been uncovered. Dozens of additional enclosures may still lie beneath the surface, their pillars still standing in the darkness, their carvings still sharp and clear, protected by the fill that has shielded them for millennia. Each new enclosure that is excavated has the potential to reveal new imagery, new architectural features, new insights into the beliefs and practices of the builders. The broader landscape around Göbekli Tepe is also yielding new discoveries at an accelerating pace. Karahan Tepe, Sayburç, and other sites are only the beginning. As archaeological survey extends across southeastern Turkey and the northern Fertile Crescent, more sites belonging to the T-pillar tradition are likely to be identified and investigated. Each new site adds to our understanding of the cultural network that produced Göbekli Tepe, filling in gaps in the geographic and chronological map and providing new points of comparison for the imagery, architecture, and practices documented at the main site. New analytical techniques are also opening new avenues of investigation. Ancient DNA analysis, isotopic studies of human and animal remains, residue analysis of stone vessels and other containers, advanced imaging techniques for documenting and analyzing carved surfaces, sediment analysis for reconstructing past environments. All of these tools are being brought to bear on the material from Göbekli Tepe and its surrounding sites, and they are yielding information that was inaccessible to earlier generations of researchers. The story of Göbekli Tepe is still being written. Every season of excavation adds new chapters. Every new analysis revises and refines the narrative. The site that Klaus Schmidt first recognized in 1994 as something extraordinary has grown, in the 3 decades since, into one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time, and it is not done growing. There is one more dimension of Göbekli Tepe that deserves attention before we conclude, and it is perhaps the most personal and the most universal. It is the dimension of wonder. Wonder is not a scientific term. It does not appear in peer-reviewed journals or in the technical language of excavation reports, but it is arguably the most important thing that Göbekli Tepe has to offer. Not to the specialist for whom the site is a rich and demanding subject of professional inquiry, but to the ordinary human being who encounters the site for the first time, whether in person, in photographs, or in words on a page. There is a moment in the encounter with Göbekli Tepe when the mind pauses, when the comfortable assumptions of everyday life are suspended. When the sheer age, the sheer ambition, the sheer improbability of what was achieved on that hilltop 12,000 years ago sinks in and takes hold. It is a moment of vertigo, a moment when the ground shifts beneath your feet, when the scale of human history opens up before you like a chasm, vast and deep and full of unsuspected wonders. 12,000 years before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, before the wheel, before writing, before bronze. Before iron, before everything we call civilization. On a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, human beings carved pillars from the living rock, decorated them with images of wild animals, erected them in great circles, and gathered beneath them to feast and worship and celebrate the mystery of being alive. They did this with nothing but stone tools and human hands. They did this with nothing but shared belief and collective will. They did this with nothing but the ancient, inextinguishable human need to create meaning, to build something that endures, to leave behind a mark that says, "This mattered, we mattered, what we believed was worth carving in stone." And then when their time was done, they buried it. They covered their great circles with earth and rubble, sealing them away beneath the hill. They walked away into a new world of farms and villages and a way of life that would gradually erase the memory of what they had built. The hilltop was silent, the pillars stood in darkness, the carvings watched no one until now. Until an archaeologist walked the surface of a rounded hill in 1994 and picked up a flint tool and realized that the hill was not a hill but a monument. Until the first trench was dug and the first pillar emerged from the earth, its surface still sharp, its carvings still clear, its message still urgent after 12,000 years of silence. What is that message? We do not know. Not fully, perhaps not ever. The builders of Göbekli Tepe spoke a language that has left no trace. They told stories that no one alive has heard. They worshipped beings whose names we will never learn. The specific content of their beliefs, the particular myths and rituals that gave meaning to their lives are lost beyond recovery, but the stones remain. And the stones tell us something, even if we cannot decode every detail of their message. They tell us that human beings have been asking the big questions for a very long time. What is the nature of the world? What forces govern it? What is the relationship between human beings and the animals, the plants, the landscape, the sky? What happens when we die? How should we live? These are the questions that religions exist to answer. These are the questions that drove the builders of Göbekli Tepe to undertake their extraordinary project. And these are the questions that we are still asking today, 12,000 years later, in different languages and different forms, but with the same urgency and the same need. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe do not give us answers, but they show us that the quest for answers is as old as civilization itself, older, in fact, than civilization itself. They show us that the human spirit, the restless, searching, meaning-making spirit that drives us to build and create and question and believe, is not a product of our modern world. It is the deepest part of who we are. It is the part of us that carved the first pillar, that erected the first monument, that gathered beneath the open sky to celebrate the mystery of existence. Göbekli Tepe is many things. It is an archaeological site of immense importance. It is a challenge to established theories of cultural evolution. It is a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of prehistoric people. It is a puzzle that will occupy scholars for generations to come. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a tourist destination. It is a subject of books, documentaries, lectures, and heated academic debates. But above all, it is a monument to the human spirit. A monument built by people we will never meet, in a language we will never speak, for reasons we will never fully understand. And yet, standing before those great stone pillars, looking up at their carved surfaces, feeling the weight of 12,000 years pressing down from every direction, we recognize something familiar, something that resonates across the vast distance of time and connects us to the people who stood here before. The same need to create, the same need to believe. The same need to say in stone and fire and song and silence, we were here and this is what mattered to us. The sun sets over Göbekli Tepe as it has set over that ridge for 12,000 years. The shadows lengthen across the stone circles. The carved animals darken as the light fades. The pillars stand as they have always stood, patient, silent, immovable. They have outlasted the people who carved them. They have outlasted the civilization that buried them. They have outlasted the centuries of forgetting that followed. They will outlast us too if we let them. If we protect them, study them, honor them, and pass them on to the future. The story of Göbekli Tepe is not finished. It is still being uncovered, still being interpreted, still being debated. New excavations are revealing new enclosures. New analyses are refining our understanding of the site's chronology, ecology, and social context. New sites are being discovered in the surrounding region, expanding the map of the monumental tradition and deepening our appreciation of the world that produced it. We stand at the beginning of a new chapter in the study of human origins and the origins of civilization, a chapter in which the old certainties have been swept away and new questions have taken their place, questions about the role of belief in driving social change. Questions about the capacity of pre-agricultural societies for complex organization. Questions about the relationship between ritual and economy, between symbol and substance, between the spiritual and the material. These are not easy questions. They do not have simple answers, but they are the right questions, the important questions, the questions that Göbekli Tepe compels us to ask. And as long as we keep asking them, as long as we keep digging, keep analyzing, keep wondering, the pillars of Göbekli Tepe will continue to speak to us across the vast silence of 12,000 years. They were the first monuments, the first temples, the first great statement of human ambition and human belief carved into the bedrock of the earth. They were raised by hands that knew nothing of metal or machinery, but everything about what it means to be human. They were buried by hands that chose, for reasons we may never understand, to consign their greatest achievement to the earth and walk away into a new world. And now they stand in the light again, waiting for us to listen, waiting for us to understand, waiting as they have always waited with the infinite patience of stone.